The small wooden shutters creaked as they swung open, letting in the dim gray light of a foggy morning. A cold mist clung to the cobbled streets, wrapping the town in a quiet stillness that felt heavier than silence itself. From the corner of a narrow alley, the smell of crushed herbs and bitter roots drifted into the air, mixing with the sour stench of mud and animals. Inside a cramped little shop, lit only by a flickering tallow candle, a man hunched over a wooden table. His hands, stained green and brown from hours of grinding and mixing, moved with both confidence and exhaustion. This was Thomas, the town's apothecary, and today would test every skill he had and every nerve he thought he could control. For anyone passing by, the shop looked harmless, almost peaceful, with bundles of dried rosemary and sage hanging from the ceiling and rows of small glass vials lining the shelves. But if you stepped closer, if you could feel the weight of what happened behind that door, you might not think it's so peaceful at all. Being a medieval apothecary was not simply about selling ointments or making sweet-smelling remedies. It was about carrying life and death in your hands every single day, and knowing that one wrong pinch of powder could kill a man just as easily as it could save him. And worse, sometimes you had to decide which of those two things you wanted to happen. Thomas had not slept properly in 3 nights. The people of the town came to him for everything: headaches, wounds, fevers, childbirth pains, and even curses they believe had been cast on them by jealous neighbors. He knew better than to call them curses, but he never corrected anyone. In a town where fear and superstition ruled, an apothecary walked a thin line. Say the wrong thing, and you could be branded a heretic, accused of witchcraft, or worse, burned alive. Say nothing, and you might be blamed when someone died anyway. Every day he felt like walking on sharp stones, barefoot and bleeding, hoping no one noticed the trail you left behind. He wiped his hands on a cloth that had once been white, but now looked like it had been buried in the earth for years. The grinding stone in front of him was filled with a mix of dried foxglove petals and crushed bark. He hesitated for a moment, staring at the fine powder as if it might speak back to him. Foxglove could slow a racing heart, could save a life, if you measured it perfectly. Too much, and the heart would stop completely. His hands trembled as he measured it into a small pouch. He thought of the patient waiting for this remedy, a wealthy merchant who had paid him in advance and made it very clear what would happen to Thomas if the medicine failed. The merchant's men had sharp knives and very little patience. This was the brutal reality of his work. People saw the apothecary as a healer, a miracle worker even, but no one thought about the pressure that came with it. Every mistake meant a life lost, and in a small town, everyone knew exactly who to blame. It wasn't just the sick who came to him. Sometimes soldiers came for poisons, pretending to want rat killers, but Thomas knew exactly what they were asking for. Sometimes desperate wives whispered about powders that could make cruel husbands sleep and never wake. He never said yes to those requests, not out of kindness, but because saying yes meant signing his own death sentence if anyone found out. Still, he wondered how many lives he had touched without ever knowing it, how many tiny choices had changed the course of someone's fate. The door to his shop creaked open, letting in a burst of cold air and the heavy thud of boots on the floor. Thomas turned quickly, trying to look calm, but his heart skipped. Standing in the doorway was not the merchant's servant, as he expected, but Father Roland, the town priest. The priest's face was tight, his lips pressed into a thin line, and his hands were folded in a way that looked more like judgment than prayer. The priest rarely came to the apothecary unless something serious was wrong. He did not trust Thomas, not entirely. Many priests didn't trust apothecaries. They were too close to the edge of what was holy and what was forbidden, too close to secrets the church preferred to control. Thomas, Father Roland said slowly, his voice as cold as the morning air. A child is sick. The villagers are saying it's witchcraft, and they're saying you might know something about it. Thomas felt his stomach tighten. He forced a calm smile, but his hand was still trembling. A child sick from witchcraft? He asked, trying to keep his voice steady. That sounds more like fever than curses, Father. The priest stepped closer, his dark robes brushing the wooden floor. You will come with me. Now, bring what you need. If this child does not get better, Thomas, you will answer for it." Those words hung heavy in the air. Thomas knew exactly what the priest meant. If the child died, it would not matter whether it was fever or bad luck or anything else. People would look for someone to blame. And in this town, it was far easier to blame an apothecary than to admit that sometimes God's will was simply cruel. Thomas gathered his things quickly, shoving small vials and pouches into a leather satchel. His heart raced, not just with fear for the child, but for himself. He had seen what angry villagers could do. They did not wait for truth. They wanted someone to burn, someone to scream for the sin of existing outside their rules. As he stepped out into the misty street, following the priest, he felt every eye on him. Whispers rose like smoke in the air. He could not hear the words, but he did not need to. He knew them already. Witch, poisoner, devil's helper. The walk to the house felt longer than it should have. The streets were slick with mud, and the smell of damp wood and manure filled his nose. His mind raced through every remedy he could think of for a sick child. It could be a simple fever, or it could be something worse, something that no herb or powder could fix. If he failed, no, he could not think of failure now. When they reached the house, Thomas paused at the door, taking a deep breath before stepping inside. The room smelled of sickness, sour and sharp, and the air felt heavy with fear. The child lay on a straw bed, her small body trembling under a rough wool blanket. Her mother sat beside her, tears streaking her face, while the father stood in the corner, his hands clenched into fists as if ready to strike someone, maybe Thomas, if things went wrong. Thomas knelt by the bed, opening his satchel, trying to focus on the work ahead. But as he looked at the child's pale face, something strange caught his eye. Her lips were slightly blue, her breathing shallow, and there was a faint trace of something on her skin, a fine, reddish powder. Thomas's mind raced. That powder was not from fever. That was something else, something dangerous, and someone had put it there deliberately. He swallowed hard, his hand freezing halfway to his bag. Someone had poisoned this child, and if he said that out loud, if he even hinted at it, who would the villagers believe? Would they believe that someone else had done this? Or would they think Thomas himself had poisoned her? His heart pounded as he glanced at the priest, who was watching him closely, almost as if he were waiting for a mistake. Thomas forced himself to breathe, to stay calm. He had to make a choice, tell the truth and risk his own life, or stay silent and hope he could save the child before it was too late. Either way, time was running out. And then, as he reached for the herbs, a shadow fell across the doorway, and a voice he knew all too well spoke from behind him. "Well, Thomas," the voice said, calm but dangerous. "It seems you've gotten yourself into quite the mess, haven't you?" Thomas froze, his fingers still on the vial. He did not need to turn to know who it was. But why was this man here now? And worse, what did he want? The air in the room felt colder suddenly, and for the first time that morning, Thomas felt something heavier than fear. He felt the weight of a secret he could no longer keep. Thomas didn't turn around right away. He didn't need to. That voice, smooth, almost mocking, belonged to Marcus, the merchant's enforcer. The same man who had warned Thomas earlier in the week that failure to heal his master would come with consequences. But Marcus had no reason to be here, not at the house of a sick child. His presence felt wrong, like a wolf wandering into a sheep pen. Thomas kept his eyes on the child, pretending to stay focused, though his heart was thudding so hard it felt as if everyone in the room could hear it. "Marcus," Thomas said carefully, trying to keep his tone even. "This isn't your business. There's a sick child here." Marcus stepped into the room, his boots scraping against the wooden floor. "Isn't my business? Everything in this town is my business, Thomas. And I'd hate to hear people whispering that our little apothecary had something to do with this child's unfortunate state." His gaze flicked toward the priest, who stood stiffly beside the doorway, his jaw tightening. The mother sobbed quietly, clutching the child's hand. The father looked between Thomas and Marcus with confusion, clearly unsure who to hate more. Thomas, however, understood perfectly well why Marcus had come. The man was not here to help. He was here to watch, to see if Thomas would succeed or fail, to see if he could use this situation to his advantage. Thomas finally looked up, meeting Marcus's eyes. If you care so much about this child, maybe you should leave and let me work. Marcus grinned, a slow, humorless smile. Oh, I'll stay. Call it curiosity. And if you fail, well, the people will need someone to blame, won't they? Better to know what happens firsthand. The room grew tense, the air thick enough to choke on. Thomas forced himself to breathe slowly, his hands steadying as he reached for his bag. He had no time to argue. The child's breathing was shallow, her skin damp with sweat. He needed to work quickly. He also needed to think carefully about how to handle the reddish powder he had seen on her skin. If he mentioned poison in front of Marcus, that could be the end of him. But if he didn't treat it properly, the girl would die. He took a small jar from his satchel, one filled with crushed charcoal and ground willow bark. It was not the strongest cure for poisoning, but it was safe enough to pass as a simple remedy for fever. She needs this, Thomas said aloud, more for the priest and the parents than for Marcus. It will calm her stomach and lower her fever. The priest stepped closer, eyeing the jar suspiciously. And you are certain this will help? Thomas nodded firmly, his voice steady now. It's the best chance she has. He glanced at the father, who was watching him like a hawk. Hold her up gently. She needs to swallow it. The father hesitated, then crouched down, lifting the child carefully. Her head lolled against his chest, her breathing rasping faintly. Thomas mixed the powder with a little water from the wooden cup beside the bed, stirring until it thickened into a muddy paste. He pressed the cup to her lips, whispering soft encouragement as he tilted it slightly. The child coughed weakly, then swallowed, her small body trembling. Minutes felt like hours as Thomas waited. He sat close, watching her breathing, hoping to see any sign of improvement. Behind him, Marcus leaned against the wall, arms crossed, clearly enjoying the tension. The priest murmured a prayer under his breath, his eyes darting between Thomas and the child as if trying to decide whether to bless him or condemn him. Finally, after what felt like forever, the child gave a small sigh. Her breathing steadied slightly, her lips losing some of their bluish tint. Thomas exhaled, barely realizing he had been holding his breath. It wasn't a cure, not yet, but it was a start. Relief swept over the mother, who clutched her child's hand tightly, whispering thanks. The father, however, stayed tense, his eyes still sharp with suspicion. She is not healed, Father Roland said, his tone cautious, but she breathes easier. She will need more of this. Every few hours, Thomas said quickly, and rest. If she survives the night, she will recover. The priest nodded slowly, but Marcus smirked, his gaze lingering on Thomas like a cat watching a mouse. Impressive, Marcus said smoothly. But you and I both know that if she doesn't survive, no one will remember how hard you tried. They'll just remember that you were here. Thomas clenched his jaw, but said nothing. He couldn't afford to. Instead, he packed away his things slowly, methodically, keeping his expression calm. But inside, his mind raced. The child's reaction confirmed his suspicion. She had been poisoned, though he couldn't prove it yet. Someone had done this deliberately, and if he didn't find out who, more children, or even adults, might fall victim. As he closed his satchel, Marcus stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Thomas could hear. You're a clever man, Thomas. Clever men survive, but only if they know when to stay quiet. I'd hate to see you misunderstood. Thomas looked up sharply, meeting Marcus's eyes. There was no mistaking the threat behind those words. Marcus wasn't warning him to stay silent about the poisoning for the child's sake. He was warning him for his own. And if Marcus was warning him, that meant Marcus knew something. Perhaps more than Thomas dared to guess. The priest turned toward Marcus, frowning. You should leave now. This is a sick room, not a place for idle talk. Marcus straightened, smiling faintly. Of course, Father. I was just concerned for the child. He gave Thomas one last look, a smile that carried more danger than kindness, then turned and strode out the door. Thomas stayed silent, staring at the doorway, even after Marcus was gone. The weight of what had just happened pressed heavily on his chest. Whoever had poisoned the child had power, enough to send a man like Marcus to watch him. This was no random act of cruelty. This was a message. and Thomas was now tangled in something far bigger than he wanted to be. The priest placed a hand on his shoulder, snapping him back to the present. "You will return tomorrow to check on her," Father Roland said firmly. "If she worsens, Thomas, it will be on your head." Thomas nodded quietly, standing and adjusting his satchel. He felt the mother's tearful eyes on him, filled with a desperate hope that he prayed he wouldn't betray. As he stepped out into the cold evening air, the sky now painted in streaks of fading orange, he could feel the town's whispers rising again, curling through the streets like smoke. He started walking back toward his shop, his boots crunching on the damp cobblestones, his mind spinning. Who had poisoned Child? And why? And why was Marcus involved? Or at least watching? The answer, Thomas suspected, would not be simple. And worse, if he searched for it too openly, he might not live long enough to find it. The fog thickened as he turned down the narrow alley leading to his shop. The air felt heavier, colder, and for a moment he thought he heard footsteps behind him. He stopped, listening carefully, but the street was empty. Still, a chill crept up his spine. When he reached his shop, he pushed the door open, stepping into the familiar scent of herbs and dried flowers. But something felt wrong. The candle he had left burning earlier had gone out, and the faint smell of smoke lingered. His grinding stone had been moved, his shelves slightly disturbed. Someone had been inside his shop while he was gone. And then, just as he moved toward the table, he saw it, a small scrap of parchment lying in the middle of the floor, as if left there deliberately. His name was written on it in hurried, dark ink. Thomas picked it up with shaking fingers. The message was short, only 5 words, but it was enough to make his stomach drop. "Stop asking questions or die." He stood frozen in the quiet shop, the parchment trembling in his hands, his heart pounding louder than ever. Thomas stared at the parchment, his fingers trembling as if the words might burn through his skin. The ink was fresh, still slightly smudged where the writer's hand had pressed too hard. Whoever had left this note hadn't just been in his shop. They had been close enough to move his things, close enough to know exactly where he worked and lived. That realization sent a sharp chill through him. His shop was his only safe place, or at least it had been. Now it felt as dangerous as the streets outside. He set the note on the table, his eyes scanning the room. Nothing was missing, but everything felt wrong, as though someone had touched every bottle, every dried herb bundle, leaving behind the weight of their threat. He moved slowly, checking the shelves, the drawers, even the floorboards, but there was no sign of who had been here. Whoever it was had wanted him to know only one thing: they were watching. Thomas sat down heavily on his wooden stool, running a hand through his hair. He had survived years in this town by keeping his head down, by treating anyone who came to him without asking too many questions. But now, against his will, he was tangled in something far bigger. A poison child. Marcus appearing at the sick room like a shadow. And now this message. It was clear. Someone didn't want him to dig deeper. But if he stayed silent, how many more would die? The candlelight flickered as a breeze slipped through the shutters. Thomas forced himself to breathe deeply, trying to steady his racing thoughts. He needed to think carefully. If he acted too soon, he might end up hanged as a poisoner, or worse, disappear quietly in the night, like others who had crossed powerful men in this town. A soft knock at the door snapped him out of his thoughts. He stiffened, his eyes darting toward the entrance. No one visited him at this hour unless it was an emergency. Slowly, he stood and approached the door, his hand hesitating on the latch. "Thomas," a quiet voice whispered from outside. "It's me, Elena." He let out a shaky breath. Elena. She was one of his few friends, a weaver who sometimes came to him for herbs to help her aching hands. Her visits were rare, but always kind, one of the few pieces of warmth in his life. Still, her being here this late made his stomach tighten. He opened the door just enough for her to slip in, glancing over her shoulder to be sure no one was following her. She stepped inside quickly, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Her brown hair was damp from the evening mist, and her eyes darted nervously toward the windows. "What are you doing here, Elena?" Thomas asked, keeping his voice low. She looked at him, her face pale. "I heard what happened with the child. People are saying it's witchcraft, Thomas. Some of them are saying it's your fault. Thomas clenched his jaw. Of course they are. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. That's not why I came. I heard something you need to know, but you can't tell anyone I told you. Thomas studied her face, the way her hands fidgeted nervously with the edge of her shawl. What did you hear? She hesitated, glancing toward the shutters as if expecting someone to burst through them. The merchant's men, she whispered finally. They've been meeting at the old mill outside town. Someone said they're keeping things there, powders, roots, things only an apothecary would recognize. They're saying the merchant is trying to control who gets medicine and who doesn't. Thomas's heart pounded faster. You're sure? She nodded quickly. I wouldn't be here if I wasn't. And, Thomas, someone saw Marcus there last night. With a box. Marcus. The image of him standing in that sick room, smirking as if he already knew the outcome, burned in Thomas's mind. This confirmed what Thomas had feared. Marcus wasn't just watching him. He was part of it. Maybe even the one who had poisoned the child. Elena, Thomas said slowly, this is dangerous information. If anyone knows you told me. I know, she said quickly, her voice tight. But if you don't stop them, more people will get sick. And next time, it won't just be a child. Thomas rubbed his forehead, trying to think. The old mill. That was where the truth might be. But going there would be suicide if he wasn't careful. Marcus and his men would be guarding it. And if they caught him, he wouldn't leave alive. I'll think of something, he said finally. But you need to leave before someone sees you here. Elena nodded, though worry still clouded her face. Be careful, Thomas. You're not the only one they'll silence if they think you know too much. He watched her slip out into the misty night, her shawl disappearing into the fog. When the door closed, Thomas sat again, staring at the parchment note still lying on the table. Stop asking questions or die. He should stay out of it. He should pretend none of this mattered. But when he pictured that child lying on the straw bed, her skin pale and trembling because of someone's greed, he knew he couldn't. If he stayed silent, he was no better than the ones doing this. Thomas spent the next hour preparing. He moved quietly around his shop, choosing what to take. A small vial of sleeping powder, a pouch of crushed valerian root to calm nerves, and, reluctantly, a small bottle of bitter nightshade. Not for others, for himself, if things went too wrong. Better to choose his own end than be dragged to the gallows as a traitor or witch. When he finally stepped outside, the streets were almost empty, the mist curling through the narrow alleys like pale smoke. The moonlight was faint, slipping between clouds, just enough to guide his steps. The old mill sat at the edge of town, past the fields, where no one went at night unless they had a reason. Thomas kept to the shadows, moving carefully, his heart pounding with every crunch of gravel under his boots. As he walked, he kept replaying Elena's words. Marcus, the powders, the merchant controlling who lived and who died. If this was true, it wasn't just greed, it was power, the kind of power that could bend the entire town to its knees. And Thomas was about to step right into the middle of it. By the time he reached the edge of the fields, the air felt colder, heavier. The mill loomed ahead, its tall wooden frame dark against the gray sky. A faint light flickered from one of the lower windows, and Thomas crouched low, keeping to the shadows. His hands tightened around the satchel at his side. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to leave this mess to someone else. But it was too late for that. He crept closer, his breath shallow, stopping behind a stack of old barrels. From here, he could hear voices, low, rough, and serious. One of them he recognized instantly. Marcus. The next shipment comes tomorrow, Marcus was saying. The merchant wants it done quietly. No mistakes this time. Another man grunted. And the apothecary? You think he suspects? Marcus laughed softly, a sound that made Thomas's stomach tighten. Oh, he suspects. But he's too smart to say anything. He knows what happens to men who talk. The other man chuckled darkly. What if he isn't smart? Then, Marcus said, his voice calm and certain. We'll make sure he doesn't talk ever again. Thomas felt his pulse hammering in his ears. He was right, they were behind the poisonings. And now they were talking about him. He should run. He should get back to his shop before they noticed him. But something kept him frozen there, his mind torn between fear and anger. Then suddenly, a sharp crack echoed from somewhere behind him, a stick snapping under his boot. The voices inside the mill went silent. And then Marcus's voice, low and sharp, cut through the night. "Someone's out there." Thomas froze, his breath caught in his throat. The night seemed to hold still with him, the fog curling around his body like cold fingers. He hadn't meant to step on that twig, but it was too late now. He pressed himself tighter against the barrels, his heart hammering so loudly he was certain they would hear it. "Check it," Marcus ordered, his voice steady and commanding. Boots scuffed against the dirt floor inside the mill, growing louder as someone approached the doorway. Thomas crouched lower, gripping his satchel tightly. He glanced toward the shadows to his right. There was a gap between the barrels and the mill wall, narrow but just big enough for him to slip through if he moved fast enough. But if he made a sound, they would find him instantly. The heavy footsteps grew closer. "Probably just a fox," one of the men muttered. "Foxes don't snap branches that loud," Marcus replied coldly. "Look properly." Thomas swallowed hard. His fingers itched toward the small vial of sleeping powder in his satchel, but he knew he couldn't risk throwing it unless they were almost on top of him. The powder needed to be breathed in to work quickly, and if he missed, he would have only seconds before they caught him. The man stepped out of the mill, his shadow stretching long across the ground under the faint moonlight. Thomas could see him now, broad-shouldered, holding a short blade, scanning the dark field. The man turned slightly, his eyes narrowing as he moved toward the barrels. Thomas shifted quietly, his boots barely brushing the dirt as he eased himself into the narrow space between the barrels and the mill wall. The rough wood scraped his coat, the smell of damp earth filling his nose as he pressed himself against the cold ground. The footsteps stopped just a few paces away. "Nothing here," the man called back. "Check again," Marcus snapped. Thomas held his breath as the man took another step, his boots crunching against the ground. The man paused, looking down toward the barrels. Thomas could see the faint gleam of his blade in the moonlight. Then, suddenly, a sharp whistle came from inside the mill. "Leave it," another voice called. "We don't have time for this." "Marcus, the merchant wants the boxes moved now." There was a long pause before Marcus replied. "Fine, but keep your eyes open. Someone's sniffing around, I can feel it." The man grunted and turned back toward the mill, his footsteps slowly fading. Thomas stayed perfectly still for another full minute, every muscle tense, before he finally dared to move. His hands trembled as he pushed himself up slightly, peering around the barrels. Through the open doorway of the mill, he could see Marcus and two other men lifting wooden crates, stacking them near a cart. The flicker of lamplight inside caught the edges of glass bottles and bundles of herbs stuffed into the boxes. So it was true. They were hoarding medicine, and more than medicine. Thomas recognized some of the shapes: sealed jars of crushed belladonna, packets of powdered hemlock, vials that looked suspiciously like distilled arsenic. These weren't just for healing. These were poisons meant to be sold or used on anyone who defied them. His stomach twisted. This was bigger than he thought. The merchant wasn't just controlling who lived and died through medicine. He was arming himself with death itself. Thomas needed proof. If he could show Father Roland or even some of the town elders what he saw, maybe, just maybe, he could convince them. But he had to be careful. One wrong move, and he would never leave this field alive. Slowly, he eased back from the barrels, crouching low as he slipped into the deeper shadows along the mill's side. If he could circle around to the back, he might find another way in, a window, a loose board, somewhere he could get closer without being seen. The ground was damp under his boots, and every step felt like a risk. He moved slowly, his breath shallow, his ears tuned to every sound. From inside, the men kept talking, their voices low but sharp. "Tomorrow night," Marcus was saying, "the merchant wants the first batch ready for distribution. If anyone refuses to pay, they don't get the medicine. And if they complain—" He paused, and Thomas could almost hear the smirk in his voice. "Well, that's what the powders are for." Thomas's jaw tightened. They were letting people die if they couldn't afford to pay. They were poisoning those who spoke against them. How many had already suffered because of this? Finally, Thomas reached the back of the mill. The wood here was older, warped from years of rain and neglect. A small window sat high on the wall, its frame cracked, one of its panes missing. He glanced around. No one was watching. With a deep breath, he crouched, gripping the edge of the wall, and slowly pulled himself up. The wood groaned under his weight, making his heart jump, but the voices inside didn't change. Carefully, he peered through the window. Inside, the lamplight flickered over the crates stacked along the walls. Marcus was leaning over a table, inspecting a list, while the other two men moved more boxes. Thomas's eyes scanned the table. Papers, records, maybe even a list of names. If he could get those, he would have proof. But how? As he crouched there, thinking, the door of the mill slammed open suddenly, making him flinch. Another man hurried inside, his breath heavy. "Marcus, we have a problem," the newcomer said. "The priest is asking questions. He wants to know why the merchant's shipments have been delayed." Marcus's face darkened. "The priest should learn to mind his prayers, not our business." But if he keeps asking questions, his voice trailed off, and then he looked directly toward the back of the mill, his eyes narrowing as if sensing something. Thomas ducked lower, his heart pounding. Had Marcus seen him? "Check the back," Marcus ordered sharply. "Now!" Thomas's pulse surged as footsteps thudded across the wooden floor. He had seconds, maybe less. His mind raced, searching for a way out. If he jumped now, they might hear him. If he stayed, they would find him for sure. Slowly, Thomas reached into his satchel, pulling out the small vial of sleeping powder. His only chance would be to surprise whoever came outside before they could call for Marcus. The footsteps grew closer. The back door creaked. Thomas crouched lower, gripping the vial tightly, his other hand already reaching for the small pouch he could throw to break it open. The door swung open with a sharp squeal, and a man stepped out, scanning the shadows. Thomas tensed, ready to move. But before he could, another voice from inside shouted urgently, "Marcus, someone's coming up the road." The man at the door hesitated, glancing back inside. Marcus's voice barked a command. "Leave it. Get inside now." The man cursed under his breath and slammed the door shut, rushing back to the others. Thomas exhaled shakily, relief washing over him. But he didn't have time to rest. Someone was coming up the road, and that meant more danger, or maybe an opportunity. He crouched lower, waiting, his heart still hammering as he listened to the approaching footsteps outside the mill. And then, through the misty night, a familiar voice cut through the silence. "Thomas," it whispered urgently. "Are you here?" Thomas's eyes widened. He knew that voice. It was Elena. But why was she here? And worse, had she just walked straight into the trap he was barely escaping? Thomas pressed his back against the cold wood of the mill wall, his heart thudding in his chest. Elena's voice drifted softly through the mist again, closer this time. "Thomas? Are you here?" She sounded nervous, her words carried by the quiet night air, but each one felt as loud as a bell to him. What was she doing here? He had told her to stay away, to keep herself out of danger. Now, if Marcus or his men heard her, she would be caught, and worse, she might give him away without meaning to. He crouched low, moving slowly toward the edge of the mill, glancing around carefully. The men inside were still talking, their voices rough and sharp, but he knew it wouldn't take much for them to step outside again. He could already imagine Marcus's reaction if he discovered Elena snooping near the mill. Thomas clenched his jaw. He had to get to her before they did. He slipped along the wall, keeping close to the shadows, his boots barely making a sound against the damp ground. The mist was thicker now, curling low around his legs, which worked in his favor, at least for now. When he finally spotted her, standing near a crooked fence post just a short distance from the mill, he felt a mix of relief and anger. She was too exposed, her shawl loose around her shoulders, her breath visible in the cold air. "Elena," Thomas hissed softly as he crept closer. "What are you doing here?" She startled, turning toward him, her eyes wide. "Thank God," she whispered, rushing closer. "I had to warn you. The priest, Father Roland, he's sending people to your shop tonight. He's starting to believe the rumors. If he finds anything suspicious, Thomas, they'll call you a witch. You won't have a chance to explain. Thomas felt the weight of her words sink into him like a stone. The timing couldn't have been worse. The villagers, already scared by the poisoned child, were turning against him faster than he feared. If they searched a shop and found the stronger herbs or the poisons he kept locked away, tools for healing, but dangerous in the wrong hands, it wouldn't matter what the truth was. They'd already decided who to blame. He took a deep breath, his mind racing. "You shouldn't have come here," he whispered urgently. "It's too dangerous. Marcus is inside. If he sees you—" Before he could finish, a noise from inside the mill made them both freeze. A chair scraped sharply against the floor, and Marcus's voice cut through the quiet, low and suspicious. "Did you hear that? Someone's still out there." Elena's eyes widened in panic. Thomas grabbed her hand without thinking, pulling her down into the mist. "Stay low," he whispered, guiding her quickly along the edge of the field. The two moved as quietly as they could, crouched against the wooden fence line. Every step felt too loud, every breath too sharp. Behind them, voices rose inside the mill. Marcus barked orders to the men, and the sound of boots moving toward the door followed. Thomas tightened his grip on Elena's hand. "We need to get out of here," he whispered. "Now." They crept toward the cover of a cluster of old trees at the edge of the field, their shadows blending into the fog. Thomas risked one quick glance back. The door of the mill swung open, lamplight spilling into the night as two men stepped out, scanning the field. Marcus followed them, his sharp gaze cutting through the mist like a blade. "Spread out," Marcus ordered. "If someone's watching, they won't get far." Thomas and Elena slipped into the trees just as one of the men started walking toward their direction. The darkness swallowed them, but Thomas didn't slow down until they were deeper into the grove, hidden from view. Only then did he allow himself to stop, his chest rising and falling heavily. Elena leaned against a tree, her face pale. "I didn't mean to make things worse," she whispered. Thomas shook his head, his frustration softened by the fear in her voice. "You were trying to help. But you have to understand, Elena, if they find you here, they won't think twice about silencing you." She nodded, swallowing hard, but her voice grew firmer as she said, "Then you have to stop them, Thomas. If what you told me about Marcus and the merchant is true, they're going to kill more people. How many will die before someone stands up to them?" Her words struck him hard because he already knew the answer. Too many. And if he did nothing, he'd be just as guilty as the ones mixing the poisons. But standing up to Marcus meant risking everything. His work, his life, even Elena's safety. He leaned against a tree, running a hand over his face. "They have crates of poison in there," he said finally, his voice low. "Enough to kill dozens of people. And Marcus has records, lists, I think. If I can get those, maybe I can prove what they're doing." Elena's eyes widened. "You're going back in there?" Thomas looked back toward the faint glow of the mill through the fog. "Not tonight. It's too dangerous. But soon. I need to figure out when they move the crates again. If I can catch them at the right time." He let the thought trail off, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to convince her or himself. Elena stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Then I'll help you." Thomas stared at her, surprised. "No, you've already risked too much." "I can help you," she insisted. "I know the roads and people talk to me. No one suspects a weaver of anything important. I can find out when the next shipment moves." He hesitated, torn between gratitude and fear. Part of him wanted to refuse, to keep her safe, but another part knew she was right. He couldn't do this alone. "Fine," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "But you have to be careful. If Marcus suspects you." "He won't," she said quickly, though her voice trembled just slightly. Thomas nodded slowly. "Then we need to move fast, before the priest turns the town against me." The weight of that thought pressed heavily on him. Father Roland's suspicion was growing, and if the villagers turned on him, Marcus wouldn't even need to silence him himself. The crowd would do it for him, fueled by fear and superstition. The distant sound of voices broke the quiet, pulling Thomas's attention back to the mill. Marcus and his men were still searching the field, their lanterns bobbing faintly in the mist. Thomas motioned for Elena to follow as he began moving carefully through the trees, putting more distance between them and the mill. The sooner they were gone, the better. But even as they walked, the tension in his chest didn't ease. He had proof to find, a poisoned child to save, in a town that was starting to believe he was the villain. And somewhere behind all of it was the merchant, pulling the strings while others suffered. As they moved farther into the night, Thomas glanced back one last time at the glow of the mill. He couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus already knew too much, that maybe he had sensed him watching. And if that was true, then every step Thomas took from now on would be a step closer to being caught. Elena's voice broke the silence as they neared the edge of town. "What will you do first?" Thomas didn't answer immediately. His mind was already turning, already planning, though every plan seemed as dangerous as the last. Finally, he said quietly, "I need to make them believe I'm not a threat. I need to act like I don't know anything until the right moment." Elena nodded slowly, but there was worry in her eyes. "And if they find out you're lying?" Thomas glanced at her, his jaw tightening. "Then I won't live long enough to regret it." The words hung heavy in the cold night air as they slipped back into the sleeping town, their footsteps soft against the cobblestones. The mist curled around them like smoke, and Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that every shadow was watching, waiting. He was running out of time, and deep down, he knew Marcus wouldn't wait long to strike first. Thomas moved quietly through the narrow streets, keeping close to the stone walls as he and Elena slipped deeper into town. The mist had thickened, swirling low across the cobblestones, hiding their steps, but did nothing to calm the tight knot in his chest. Every flicker of light from a window, every creak of wood in the distance felt like a threat. When they finally reached his shop, Thomas hesitated before unlocking the door. His eyes scanned the alley carefully, searching for any movement. He had no doubt Marcus had men watching him, waiting for him to slip. The parchment note he had found earlier still burned in his mind. "Stop asking questions, or die." "Go home, Elena," Thomas whispered, turning to her. "You've done enough tonight." Elena shook her head. "You need help. What if someone's inside again? What if they're waiting for you?" Thomas glanced at the shuttered windows of his shop. She was right to worry, but he couldn't risk her being caught with him. "If Marcus finds out you're helping me, he won't hesitate to hurt you. Go home. Keep your head down, listen for rumors, and find out what you can about that next shipment." Elena looked like she wanted to argue, but after a long pause, she nodded reluctantly. "Be careful, Thomas," she whispered, pulling her shawl tighter before disappearing into the fog. Thomas watched her go until she vanished completely, then turned back to the door. He slid the key into the lock slowly, his other hand ready to grab the small vial of sleeping powder from his satchel if he needed it. The door creaked softly as he pushed it open. Inside, the shop was dark, the smell of herbs heavy in the air. The shelves were still slightly disturbed from earlier, but nothing else seemed moved. Thomas stepped inside, closing the door behind him, and lit a small candle. The warm glow spread across the wooden shelves, reflecting off the glass jars. Everything looked normal, but normal no longer felt safe. He sat at his work table, staring at the parchment note again. His mind was a storm of thoughts. The poisoned child, Marcus's threats, Elena's warning about Father Roland, and now the evidence sitting just beyond his reach in that mill. He leaned back, rubbing his tired eyes. His shop had always been a place of healing, but now it felt like a cage. If the priests sent men to search tonight, they could take anything they didn't understand as evidence against him. The thought made his chest tighten. The dried bundles of deadly herbs he kept locked away for emergencies. Henbane, aconite, foxglove could be enough to convince anyone he was a poisoner. He stood abruptly and moved to the shelves, pulling down jars and packets. His hands moved quickly but carefully, sorting through what he needed to hide. He took the most dangerous herbs and powders and tucked them into a small wooden box, one he had used years ago to store rare spices. He would bury it outside town at first light. As he worked, a soft noise from outside made him freeze. A faint scuff, like a boot on stone. His heart jumped. He quickly snuffed the candle, plunging the shop into darkness. Thomas moved quietly to the window, crouching as he peered through the shutters. A lantern bobbed faintly in the distance, moving slowly down the street. For a moment, he thought it might be Marcus's men, but then he recognized the robes, a town guard, probably sent by Father Roland to keep watch on him. He sank back, leaning against the wall. They were already keeping him under suspicion. He would have to be careful leaving town tomorrow. The night passed slowly, every sound making him flinch, but no one knocked on his door. When dawn finally broke, he was still sitting at his table, the wooden box of dangerous herbs packed and ready. He hadn't slept a moment. By the time the morning fog began to lift, Thomas was already outside, moving quickly through the narrow back alleys to avoid the main street. He carried the box wrapped in a cloth, his steps fast but careful. He needed to bury it where no one would find it, at least until he cleared his name. He chose a small patch of overgrown ground near the old cemetery, where few people ever went. The soil was damp, soft enough to dig with his small trowel. As he worked, his mind wandered back to the poisoned child. He needed to check on her soon, but if the priest was already watching him, that might not be easy. When the box was finally buried, Thomas brushed the dirt from his hands and stood, his breath misting in the cool morning air. He felt slightly lighter, knowing the herbs were hidden, but the tension in his chest didn't ease. He was only buying himself time, nothing more. He headed back toward his shop, keeping to the quieter paths. Along the way, he passed groups of villagers whispering in tight clusters. Their eyes followed him as he walked by, their voices dropping to murmurs. "There's the apothecary," one woman muttered. "They say the child got worse after he treated her." "Some say he uses forbidden herbs," another whispered. "That's why she's sick." Thomas kept his head down, ignoring them, but each word felt like a stone thrown at him. The rumors were spreading faster than he expected, and soon it wouldn't matter what the truth was. When he reached his shop, Elena was waiting near the doorway, her shawl pulled tight against the morning chill. She looked tired, her eyes shadowed, but when she saw him, she stepped forward quickly. "I heard something," she whispered. "Two men at the market were talking about the merchants' wagons. They're moving another shipment tonight. Marcus will be with them." Thomas's heart quickened. "Where?" "They said the North Road, near the river crossing. They're taking it out of town before sunrise." Thomas nodded slowly, his mind already racing with plans. "That's our chance. If I can follow them, maybe I can find out where they're storing everything." Elena frowned. "Thomas, that's too dangerous. If they catch you." "I know," he said, his voice firm, "but this might be my only chance to get proof." Elena hesitated, then sighed. "Then at least let me help. I can distract them, maybe give you time to look inside the wagon." Thomas shook his head quickly. "No, if they catch you, they'll kill you, Elena. I can't let that happen." Her eyes hardened. "And if they catch you, they'll kill you. But you're still going." Thomas looked at her for a long moment, torn between fear and gratitude. She was right. He couldn't do this alone. Finally, he nodded. "All right, but we have to be careful. One mistake and it's over." Elena gave a small, nervous smile. "Then we can't make mistakes." Thomas glanced out the window, watching the pale morning sunlight cutting through the mist. Tonight, everything would change, one way or another. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus was already expecting him. And if that was true, tonight might be the night Thomas wouldn't come back at all. Thomas spent the day in his shop, pacing between shelves as his mind worked through every possible way the night could go wrong. He packed his satchel carefully, choosing only what he might need: small jars of sleeping powder, a thin blade hidden in the folds of his coat, and a pouch of dried valerian to steady his nerves if he had to stay still for long hours. Every movement felt deliberate, but his hands still shook slightly as he worked. The rumors outside were getting worse. Every time he heard footsteps on the street, his stomach tightened, expecting angry knocks on the door. The murmur of voices drifted in through the shutters, words like witch, poison, and murderer whispered in low tones. By nightfall, he feared it would take only one frightened villager shouting too loudly to gather a mob. Elena arrived just before dusk, slipping quietly into the shop. She pulled back her shawl, her cheeks flushed from walking fast, her eyes sharp with worry. "The wagons are already being loaded," she said softly. "I passed the North Road on my way here. 2 men were talking about leaving after midnight. Marcus is with them." Thomas nodded, closing the satchel and adjusting the strap across his shoulder. "Then we need to move before they leave. If we follow them from the start, we can find out exactly where they're going." Elena frowned. "You're sure you want to follow them the whole way? That's dangerous, Thomas. If they're taking the shipment out of town, it might be far, and Marcus knows how to spot someone tailing him." Thomas tightened his jaw. "If we don't follow them, we'll never know where they're storing the rest of the poisons. If I can find their main supply, I might be able to convince the priest, or at least someone, of the truth." Elena hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Then we'll do it. But we'll need to stay far enough behind that they won't hear us. And if something goes wrong—" She paused, her voice dropping. "Promise me you won't do anything foolish to save me." Thomas gave her a small, tired smile. "I could say the same to you." The last bit of daylight faded as they left the shop, keeping to the narrow alleys to avoid being seen. The mist had returned, curling low around the streets, softening the edges of the houses and making everything feel distant, unreal. It was a blessing and a danger. The fog would hide them, but it would also make it harder to see what was ahead. They reached the North Road just as the first cart rolled into view. Thomas pulled Elena into the shadows behind a low stone wall, crouching as the wagon passed. The wheels creaked under the weight of stacked crates, and Thomas caught glimpses of sealed jars and bundles tied tightly with rope. 2 men walked beside the cart, both carrying short blades. Then Marcus appeared, riding on a black horse, his posture straight and commanding. Even from a distance, Thomas could feel the sharpness of his gaze as he scanned the road. Marcus looked calm, almost casual, but there was something in his expression that made Thomas's stomach twist. He looked like a man who expected trouble. When the wagons moved past, Thomas waited until they were several paces ahead before motioning to Elena. They followed quietly, keeping to the roadside where the mist was thickest. Every step was careful, the soft crunch of dirt under their boots sounding too loud in the still night. The wagons moved slowly, the horses plodding along, and Thomas used the time to study everything he could. The crates were unmarked, but he could tell from the way the men handled them that they were valuable, maybe fragile. After nearly half an hour, the road curved into the forest, the trees rising tall and dark on either side. The mist hung heavier here, and the wagon wheels groaned against the damp ground. Thomas slowed his pace, staying farther back, his eyes darting constantly to the shadows. "They're heading toward the old stone bridge," Elena whispered. Thomas nodded slightly. That road led out of town toward the merchant's larger estate. But there were other places it could lead: hidden farmhouses, abandoned mills, places where someone could hide crates without raising suspicion. They followed for what felt like an hour, their nerves stretched thin with every crunch of the cart wheels. Twice, the wagon stopped, and Thomas and Elena froze, pressed against trees, barely breathing until the men moved on. Finally, the group reached the bridge. The wagon slowed as they crossed, the wooden planks creaking under the weight. Marcus rode to the front, glancing around carefully. For a tense moment, Thomas thought Marcus might turn and look straight at them, but the man's attention shifted back to the road ahead. Once they crossed the bridge, the wagons turned off the main road, following a narrow path deeper into the forest. Thomas frowned. "That's not the way to the merchant's estate," he whispered. Elena looked at him, her brow furrowed. "Then where are they going?" Thomas shook his head, his curiosity sharpening. "Someplace hidden, which means we're close." They moved more carefully now, the forest closing in around them, branches creaking softly in the cold breeze. The wagons finally stopped near a clearing surrounded by old stone ruins, half covered in moss. Thomas recognized the place. It was an abandoned hunting lodge, long forgotten by most of the town. Marcus dismounted, giving quiet orders to the men. They began unloading the crates, stacking them inside what was left of the lodge walls. Thomas crouched low behind a cluster of bushes, peering through the branches. From here, he could see clearly jars of herbs, bottles of powders, and rows of small glass vials sealed with wax. It was worse than he expected, enough poison to supply an army. "We need to get closer," Thomas whispered. "If I can see the labels on those jars, I can prove it." Elena grabbed his arm. "Thomas, no. If they see you, I'll stay low," he said quickly. "I just need to get close enough to read what's on those crates." Elena's grip tightened, but after a moment, she nodded reluctantly. "Be quick." Thomas took a deep breath, then slowly moved from cover, keeping low as he crept closer to the ruins. His heart pounded in his chest with every step. The men were busy unloading, talking quietly, not looking toward the trees. He reached a pile of broken stones near the edge of the clearing, crouching behind them. From here, he could see everything clearly. The nearest crate had writing on the side, faint but readable in the lamplight. He squinted, his breath catching as he read the words. "Property of Merchant Edric, for restricted use only." And underneath that, smaller but clearer, "Nightshade extract, lethal dose." His stomach tightened. There it was, proof that the merchant was deliberately storing poison. If he could get even one of those crates back to the town, it would be undeniable. But before he could move, Marcus's voice cut sharply through the clearing. "Hold on," Marcus said, his tone suddenly tense. "Did you hear that?" Thomas froze. His heart lurched as Marcus turned his head, his sharp eyes scanning the shadows. And this time, Marcus looked straight toward where Thomas crouched. Thomas didn't move, didn't even breathe. Marcus's eyes swept over the clearing, sharp and searching, lingering on the very spot where Thomas crouched behind the broken stones. The men stopped unloading the crates, their hands hovering near their blades, waiting for Marcus's command. The forest went silent, the mist curling low across the ground, as if holding its breath along with him. "I heard something," Marcus said finally, his tone calm but edged with suspicion. "Check the trees." Two of the men moved instantly, stepping toward the woods with their lanterns held high. Their boots crunched on the damp leaves, the light throwing jagged shadows across the clearing. Thomas pressed himself tighter against the stones, praying the mist would be thick enough to hide him. From the other side of the trees, Elena shifted, barely audible, but Thomas caught the faint sound of her moving away, drawing their attention. A twig snapped sharply in the distance. "There!" one of the men shouted, rushing toward the sound. Marcus's eyes narrowed, but he didn't move. "Go," he ordered. "Bring me whoever's watching." The men hurried toward the noise, disappearing into the trees. Thomas stayed low, his pulse hammering. Elena was trying to lead them away, risking herself to give him a chance. He wanted to go after her, to stop her from being caught, but if he moved now, Marcus would see him instantly. Marcus remained by the wagon, watching the woods with cold patience. His hand rested casually on his sword hilt, as if he already expected to catch whoever was spying. Thomas forced himself to stay still, even as his stomach twisted with worry for Elena. He waited, every second stretching painfully, until the sound of voices faded deeper into the forest. Slowly, Thomas dared to move again, inching closer to the crates. His hands trembled as he pulled a small scrap of parchment from his satchel and quickly scribbled down the words he had read on the boxes. "Nightshade extract, lethal dose. Property of Merchant Edric." He added a few more details he could see from here: belladonna powder, hemlock roots. As he worked, Marcus turned suddenly, his sharp gaze sweeping the clearing again. Thomas ducked lower, holding his breath, his hand pressed flat against the stone. For a tense moment, Marcus stared straight toward him, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if sensing something out of place. Then one of the men returned, panting. "Nothing in the woods, Marcus. Just a deer, maybe." Marcus didn't look convinced. His eyes stayed fixed on the trees. "Keep searching. Someone's watching us. I can feel it." Thomas's heart raced faster. Marcus's instincts were too sharp. He wouldn't give up easily. The men spread out again, scanning the woods. Thomas knew he couldn't stay here much longer. One wrong move, and Marcus would find him. He tucked the parchment back into his satchel and began retreating slowly, keeping low and moving behind the stones. The moment his boots touched the soft earth of the forest floor, Marcus shifted, his head snapping toward him. Thomas froze, every muscle tense, praying Marcus hadn't seen him. But Marcus didn't call out. Not yet. Instead, he motioned for one of the men to circle around. "Check that side," he said, his voice low. Thomas moved faster now, staying low as he slipped back into the shadows of the trees. He needed to find Elena before Marcus's men did. If they caught her, everything would be over. Marcus would know someone had been following him, and Thomas wouldn't stand a chance of staying hidden in town after tonight. The forest felt endless, every tree looking the same in the heavy mist. Thomas listened carefully, straining to hear anything beyond the rustle of leaves. Finally, a faint whisper carried through the darkness. "Thomas," Elena hissed, her voice barely audible. He followed the sound, moving quickly but quietly, until he found her crouched behind a fallen tree. Her shawl was snagged on a branch, and her face was pale, her breath uneven. "They didn't see me," she whispered as soon as he reached her. "But they're still looking." Thomas crouched beside her, glancing back toward the clearing. The faint glow of lanterns flickered between the trees as Marcus's men moved slowly, methodically. "We need to leave now," Thomas whispered. "We have what we need." Elena's eyes darted toward his satchel. "You got proof?" Thomas nodded. "Enough to make them listen. If I can get this to Father Roland, maybe he'll believe me." Elena's expression was doubtful, and Thomas understood why. The priest already suspected him. Convincing him would take more than a few scribbled notes. But it was a start. They moved carefully through the forest, keeping to the darkest parts of the path. The wagons were still being unloaded behind them, Marcus's voice carrying faintly through the mist as he gave orders. By the time they reached the old stone bridge again, Thomas felt his muscles aching from tension. He glanced back one last time, half expecting to see Marcus standing on the road, watching them leave. But the clearing was hidden now by the trees and fog. As they crossed the bridge, Elena finally spoke again, her voice low. "Do you really think the priest will believe you, even with proof?" Thomas tightened his grip on the satchel. "I don't know, but I have to try. If I do nothing, more people will die. Maybe the whole town will turn against me anyway, but at least I won't stay silent while Marcus poisons everyone for coin." Elena gave him a long look, then nodded slowly. "Then I'll stand with you, no matter what happens." The weight of her words settled on him, heavy but strangely comforting. He didn't know if he could protect her from what was coming, but he wouldn't let her face it alone. When they finally reached the edge of town, the streets were quiet, the mist clinging to the walls like ghostly fingers. Thomas paused, scanning the shadows carefully. Every dark corner felt dangerous now, every flicker of light behind a window suspicious. They slipped back toward a shop, keeping close to the walls. Just as they reached the door, a voice spoke from the shadows, making them both freeze. "Out late, aren't you, Apothecary?" Thomas turned slowly, his stomach twisting. Marcus stood across the street, his figure barely visible in the mist, his hands resting casually on his belt. His expression was calm, almost friendly, but his eyes gleamed in the faint light like a predator's. Thomas didn't answer, his mind racing. Marcus tilted his head slightly, studying him in silence before finally speaking again. "You should get some rest," Marcus said, his tone smooth but carrying a weight of warning. "You'll need it for what's coming." Without another word, Marcus turned and disappeared back into the fog, his boots silent against the cobblestones. Thomas stood frozen for a long moment, his heart pounding. Marcus knew. He might not have proof, but he knew. Elena touched his arm gently, her face pale. "Thomas, what do we do now?" Thomas swallowed hard, staring at the mist where Marcus had vanished. "We move faster," he said quietly, before he makes the first move. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus already had. Thomas barely slept that night. Even after Marcus disappeared into the fog, the weight of his words lingered in the air like a threat whispered directly into his ear. He sat at his work table, candlelight flickering over his hands as he stared at the parchment filled with his hurried notes. The crates, the poison labels, the merchant's name, it was enough to raise suspicion, but was it enough to convince Father Roland? The priest was a careful man, but he was also cautious to the point of stubbornness. And now, with the whole town whispering about the dangerous apothecary, Thomas had to tread carefully. One wrong word could make Roland believe Marcus's version of the story instead of his own. Elena sat across from him, her face drawn from exhaustion. She hadn't left, even though he'd told her she should rest. She watched him in silence for a long time before finally speaking. "You're going to see the priest in the morning, aren't you?" Thomas nodded slowly, running a hand through his hair. "I don't have a choice. If the town keeps turning against me, I'll lose any chance to stop Marcus. Roland is the only one with enough influence to stand up to the merchant." Elena leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Then you need to think carefully about how you tell him. If he already doubts you, and Marcus has been spreading rumors." Thomas sighed. "I know. I have to make him see that I'm trying to save lives, not take them. If I can make him look into the merchant's shipments himself, maybe he'll realize the truth." But deep down, Thomas knew it wouldn't be that simple. Roland was a man of faith, and men of faith didn't always trust apothecaries with strange powders and dangerous herbs. The candle burned low as the night crept by. Thomas wrote and rewrote the points he wanted to make, try to shape them into something the priest might believe. But no matter how many times he tried, it all felt fragile, like a single accusation from Marcus could break everything apart. When morning finally came, the streets were still gray with mist as Thomas left his shop. Elena wanted to come, but he insisted she stay behind. If things went badly, she would only draw more suspicion by standing at his side. The walk to the church felt longer than usual, every set of eyes he passed watching him closely. A few people whispered openly as he walked by, their glances sharp and filled with doubt. He kept his head down, ignoring them, but he could feel their fear like a weight pressing against him. The church doors stood open when he arrived, the faint sound of morning prayers echoing inside. Father Roland was at the altar, his hands clasped, his expression calm but distant. When he saw Thomas, his brow furrowed slightly. "Thomas," the priest said, his voice even, "I was told you wished to speak with me." Thomas stepped forward, keeping his tone respectful but firm. "Yes, Father. It's important. I know you've heard the rumors about me, but I need you to listen to the truth before you judge me." Roland studied him for a long moment before nodding slightly. "Come with me," he said, leading him into a smaller side room away from the other parishioners. The room was quiet, the only light coming from a small window where the sun struggled to cut through the mist. Roland sat across from him, folding his hands. "Speak," he said simply. Thomas took a deep breath, pulling the folded parchment from his satchel. "The poisoned child, it wasn't for my medicines. Marcus and the merchant are storing poisons in secret. They're controlling who gets medicine and who doesn't. I followed one of their shipments last night. I saw the crates myself." Roland raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "You're accusing Marcus of poisoning the town? That's a serious claim, Thomas." Thomas nodded, pushing the parchment forward. "I wrote down everything I saw. The crates are marked nightshade extract, belladonna, lethal doses, all labeled with the merchant's name. I know where they're hiding them. If you send someone to search, you'll find them." Roland glanced at the parchment, but didn't pick it up right away. His gaze stayed fixed on Thomas, weighing him. "You have always worked with dangerous herbs, Thomas. How do I know this isn't a way to turn suspicion away from yourself?" Thomas's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice calm. "Because if I wanted to harm anyone, I wouldn't be here begging you to help me stop them. Father, I became an apothecary to heal people, not to let them die because they can't pay a corrupt merchant." For a moment, Roland said nothing. Then, slowly, he reached for the parchment, scanning the words Thomas had written. His brow furrowed slightly as he read, but his face remained guarded. "This is troubling," Roland admitted after a long silence. "But written words aren't proof. If what you say is true, I can't accuse Marcus or the merchant without evidence." Thomas leaned forward, his voice urgent. "Then come with me. Tonight. I could take you to the place. You'll see for yourself." Roland hesitated, clearly torn. "If this is a trap, Thomas, if you're lying." Thomas shook his head firmly. "I'm not lying. You'll see the crates yourself." Roland studied him for another long moment before finally nodding slowly. "Very well. Tonight I will come. But if there is nothing there, you will have to answer to the town for these accusations." Thomas felt a flicker of relief, though it was tangled with dread. "Thank you, Father. You won't regret this." Roland stood, folding the parchment. "Meet me here after nightfall. We'll go together." Thomas nodded and left quickly, not wanting to draw more attention. But as he stepped back onto the street, his relief was short-lived. Marcus had spies everywhere, and if he somehow learned Thomas was bringing the priest to the hidden crates, he would move them, or worse. The rest of the day passed in tense silence. Thomas stayed inside his shop, pretending to work while keeping an eye on the street. Elena arrived by midday, her expression anxious as soon as she stepped in. "Well?" she asked. He agreed. Thomas said quietly, "Roland will come tonight." Elena's shoulders sagged with relief, but her face remained tense. "Do you think Marcus knows?" Thomas looked toward the shuttered window, watching the faint shapes of villagers passing outside. "If he doesn't yet, he will soon. Marcus isn't stupid, and if he suspects what I'm doing—" Elena's voice dropped, almost to a whisper. "Then he won't just move the crates. He'll come for you." Thomas didn't answer. The thought had been in his mind since leaving the church, and the quiet weight of it grew heavier as the day wore on. When the sun began to set, the mist returned, thicker than ever, crawling low across the streets like smoke. Thomas checked his satchel again, making sure he had the parchment and a small vial of sleeping powder, just in case. Elena insisted on coming, but Thomas shook his head. "If something happens tonight, you can't be there. Stay hidden. If I don't come back, you'll need to be the one to tell people the truth." Elena grabbed his arm, her eyes fierce despite the fear in them. "Don't talk like that. You're coming back, Thomas. You have to." Thomas gave her a small, tired smile. "I'll try." He left her standing in the doorway, watching him disappear into the mist. By the time he reached the church, Father Roland was already waiting, his cloak pulled tightly around him. His expression was serious, his eyes sharp as he looked at Thomas. "Lead the way," Roland said quietly. Thomas nodded, glancing around the empty street before starting toward the north road. The mist swallowed them both as they moved, the only sound the soft crunch of their boots on the damp ground. The forest ahead loomed dark and silent, the same path Thomas had taken the night before. Every step tightened the knot in his chest, because he couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus was already waiting for them. And if Marcus was waiting, tonight might end in blood before they even reached the ruins. The forest swallowed them in silence as Thomas and Father Roland moved deeper along the narrow path. The mist clung to the ground, curling around their boots, and the trees loomed like tall, dark sentinels. Every crunch of damp leaves beneath their feet felt too loud, like a warning to anyone listening. Thomas kept glancing behind them, his nerves stretched tight. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. Father Roland walked just behind him, his steps careful, his breathing steady. He hadn't spoken since they left town, his expression unreadable under the shadow of his hood. Thomas wondered if the priest believed him at all, or if Roland was only here to catch him in a lie. The closer they got to the clearing, the heavier the air felt. Thomas slowed his steps, motioning for Roland to do the same. "The ruins are just ahead," he whispered. "Last night, they were unloading crates here. If they haven't moved them yet, we should see everything." Roland nodded, his face unreadable. He followed Thomas quietly, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, curiosity, maybe even a hint of doubt beginning to waver. They moved closer, crouching low as they approached the edge of the clearing. Through the mist, Thomas could just make out the stone walls of the old hunting lodge, its broken roof sagging under years of decay. Faint light glowed between the cracks of the stones. Lanterns. Thomas's pulse quickened. They were still here. He crouched behind a cluster of bushes, motioning for Roland to stay low. Slowly, Thomas parted the branches to get a better view. Marcus's men were in the clearing, moving quietly, stacking crates against the old walls. The same sealed jars, the same bundles of dried herbs tied with twine. And there, Thomas's breath caught. Marcus himself, standing near the lantern, his arms crossed as he gave quiet orders. Roland's eyes narrowed as he peered through the branches. "Those are the poisons you spoke of," he whispered. Thomas nodded, keeping his voice low. "Yes. Look at the markings on the crates." Roland squinted, leaning slightly to get a clearer view. One of the crates was tilted, the words "Nightshade extract" catching the flicker of lantern light. Roland's face changed, his mouth tightened, his brow furrowing as the truth started sinking in. "This is worse than I thought," Roland murmured. Thomas felt a surge of hope. If the priest had seen enough to believe him, they could finally stop Marcus. But before he could say anything, Roland's hand shot out suddenly, gripping Thomas's arm. "Wait," Roland said sharply. Thomas froze, his breath catching. Marcus had stopped speaking to his men. Slowly, his head turned toward the trees, his sharp gaze sweeping the edge of the clearing like he could feel them watching. Thomas held his breath, staying as still as the stones around them. Marcus took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. "We're not alone," he said quietly, his voice carrying in the still air. His men tensed immediately, hands moving to their weapons. One of them lifted a lantern, swinging it slowly toward the trees. The light flickered dangerously close to their hiding place. Roland's grip tightened on Thomas's arm. "We need to leave. Now," he whispered. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest. "If we leave, they'll move the crates. This is our only chance to expose them." Roland looked torn, but the lantern was getting closer, and Marcus's sharp eyes were scanning every shadow. Suddenly, Marcus raised his hand, signaling to his men. "Search the woods. Whoever's out there, find them." The men moved quickly, splitting into pairs as they started toward the trees. The crunch of their boots on the damp ground grew louder, closer. Thomas grabbed Roland's sleeve. "We have to move, but quietly. If they catch us—" Roland nodded, his expression grim. They began retreating slowly, crouching low and keeping to the thickest shadows. Thomas's every muscle felt tight, ready to spring at the slightest sound. The mist shifted as they moved, making it harder to see where Marcus's men were. A branch snapped suddenly somewhere to their right. One of the men shouted, "Over here!" Thomas's chest tightened. "Run," he whispered. They moved fast now, their footsteps muffled by the damp leaves. The shouts grew louder behind them, the glow of lanterns cutting through the mist as Marcus's men gave chase. Thomas darted between the trees, trying to stay ahead, his breath loud in his ears. Roland kept up surprisingly well, his cloak catching on branches but never slowing him down. They veered off the main path, heading toward the thicker part of the forest. Thomas's mind raced. If they could lose Marcus's men in the trees, they might still make it back to town before dawn. But every step felt like Marcus was just behind them, watching, waiting. Suddenly, Roland stumbled, catching his foot on a root. Thomas turned quickly, grabbing his arm before he fell. The priest winced but stayed on his feet. "Go," Roland said through gritted teeth. "I'll catch up." "No," Thomas said firmly. "We're not splitting up." But the delay cost them. A voice shouted nearby, closer than before. Lantern light flickered through the mist, only a few paces behind. Thomas grabbed Roland's arm tighter, pulling him forward. "This way," he whispered, leading him toward a narrow animal trail hidden by low branches. They pushed through the brush, branches scratching their arms as they moved. The sounds of pursuit grew louder, Marcus's men crashing through the undergrowth. Thomas's heart raced as he glanced back. A flash of light broke through the mist, a lantern swinging wildly as one of the men sprinted after them. Then Marcus's voice rang out, calm but sharp, cutting through the forest. "Don't kill them. Bring them to me." Thomas felt a cold shiver run through him. Marcus didn't just want to stop them. He wanted them alive, which was somehow worse. They broke through a dense patch of trees, stumbling onto a narrow path. The town was still far, but if they could stay ahead just a little longer, they might reach the outer fields before Marcus caught up. Roland glanced at Thomas, his face pale but determined. "If we make it back, I'll stand with you. I'll tell them everything I saw." Thomas nodded, his breath ragged. "We just have to make it back." But even as he said it, the sound of boots pounding on the path behind them grew closer. Marcus's men were gaining fast, their lanterns glowing brighter in the mist. Thomas pushed forward harder, every step a desperate effort to stay ahead. But the forest felt like it was closing in, every shadow twisting, every sound magnified. And then, ahead on the path, another figure stepped out of the mist. Marcus. He stood calmly, his arms crossed, blocking their way. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes burned with cold triumph as he looked straight at Thomas. "You should have stayed in your shop, apothecary," Marcus said, his voice quiet but carrying easily in the silence. Thomas skidded to a stop, his breath heavy, Roland nearly colliding with him. Behind them, the shouts of the other men closed in, cutting off their retreat. They were trapped. Marcus took a slow step forward, his boots silent on the damp earth. "Now," he said, his tone almost casual, "we're going to have a very serious talk about what you've been doing in my forest." Thomas's mind raced, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might break his ribs. He glanced at Roland, who looked just as tense, his hands clenched at his sides. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. And Marcus was smiling now, a sharp, knowing smile, as if everything was going exactly the way he had planned. Thomas stood frozen, the damp air heavy between them as Marcus took another step forward. The mist curled around his boots, swallowing the edges of his dark figure, but his sharp eyes glinted through the haze, locked firmly on Thomas. Roland shifted beside him, his breathing quick and uneven, but Thomas didn't move. Every instinct screamed to run, but there was nowhere to go, not with Marcus's men closing in behind them. Marcus stopped just a few paces away, tilting his head slightly, studying Thomas the way a hunter studies cornered prey. "You've been busy," Marcus said finally, his tone calm, almost conversational. "Following wagons, sneaking through my forest, writing little notes for the priest. Very clever." His eyes flicked briefly toward Roland before returning to Thomas. "But foolish." Thomas forced himself to keep his voice steady. "You're poisoning people, selling death for coin. You think no one will notice, but now we have proof." The priest saw the crates. Marcus's smile widened slightly, but it wasn't friendly. It was cold and sharp. "Proof? You think words on paper and a frightened priest will matter? Even if you make it back to town, who do you think they'll believe? The apothecary everyone whispers about, or the man who feeds half this village?" Roland straightened slightly at Marcus's words, his expression hardening despite the fear in his eyes. "I saw the markings myself. If you move against Thomas, you move against the church." Marcus raised an eyebrow, almost amused. "The church," he repeated, his voice low and mocking. "Do you think faith scares me, father? Do you think anyone will care what you saw when they're told Thomas was caught poisoning wells? People will believe whatever I tell them. That's how this works." Thomas clenched his fists at his sides, anger simmering under his fear. "You can't keep this hidden forever. Sooner or later, someone else will see the truth." Marcus stepped closer, his voice dropping lower, colder. "Maybe, but not tonight." Behind them, the sound of footsteps grew louder as Marcus's men finally caught up, their lanterns casting long, flickering shadows across the path. The forest seemed to tighten around them, every tree leaning in as if to listen. Marcus glanced briefly at his men before looking back at Thomas. "You could have stayed in your shop. You could have minded your own business, sold your harmless little tonics, and no one would have cared. But you had to make this difficult." Thomas's mind raced, searching for any way out. Running was impossible, they were surrounded. Fighting was madness, but standing still meant being taken. He glanced briefly at Roland, who was watching Marcus with a tense, almost defiant expression. Marcus seemed to notice the glance. "Don't worry, father," Marcus said, his tone almost polite. "You're not my enemy. You can go back to your church. Tell them whatever story you like. No one will listen." Roland's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Then Marcus looked back at Thomas, his smile fading into something colder. "But you can't be allowed to talk. Not after tonight." The words settled in the air like ice. Marcus wasn't just threatening to silence him politically. He was ready to end this permanently. Thomas's pulse pounded in his ears. He could feel the weight of the satchel at his side, the small vial of sleeping powder tucked inside. It wasn't much, but might be his only chance. His mind raced through possibilities, distract Marcus, create confusion, run for the trees. But Marcus's men were already stepping closer, their lanterns swinging, their hands resting on their blades. Marcus took another step forward, his voice soft, almost conversational again, though his eyes were sharp as knives. "I'll give you one chance, Thomas. Walk back to your shop and burn every note you wrote. Forget what you saw. Stay quiet, and maybe you'll be left alone." Thomas didn't answer immediately. His hands tightened at his sides, his mind torn between fear and the burning anger that had been growing since the first poisoned child had been carried into his shop. Marcus tilted his head, watching him carefully. "Well, what will it be?" Thomas met Marcus's gaze, his voice low but firm. "I can't stay quiet." For a moment, silence hung between them, heavy and unbroken. Then Marcus's smile returned, thin and cold. "I thought you'd say that." Marcus raised his hand slightly, signaling his men. The lanterns shifted as the men closed in, forming a tight circle around Thomas and Roland. The forest suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier, as if the trees themselves were leaning closer to watch. Roland stepped slightly in front of Thomas, his voice firm despite the danger. "If you harm him, Marcus, you'll answer to more than just me. The people will." Marcus cut him off with a sharp glance. "The people will believe whatever they're told, and by morning, they'll believe Thomas tried to attack me." Thomas's stomach twisted, but his mind sharpened. If Marcus wanted to stage this as an attack, maybe he could turn that to his advantage. His hand drifted slowly toward his satchel, pretending to shift his weight, hoping none of Marcus's men noticed. But Marcus noticed everything. His eyes flicked briefly to Thomas's movement, and his smile widened just slightly. "Don't," Marcus said softly, almost playfully. "You'll only make this worse." Thomas froze, his hand still hovering near the satchel. Marcus took one last step forward, standing just a few feet away now, his presence looming. "Take him," Marcus ordered quietly. Two of the men moved instantly, stepping closer, reaching for Thomas's arms. Thomas's heart pounded. He had only seconds to act. His fingers brushed the edge of the satchel, closing around the small vial hidden inside. As the first man reached for him, Thomas made his move, jerking the vial free and smashing it to the ground. A soft puff of fine white powder burst upward, swirling in the damp air. The men staggered back instinctively, coughing as the powder spread. One of them swore loudly, waving a hand in front of his face. Marcus stepped back quickly, his expression sharpening. Though he didn't cough, he had moved too fast to breathe it in. His eyes locked on Thomas, cold and calculating now, no trace of amusement left. Thomas grabbed Roland's arm. "Run!" They pushed through the gap in the circle, darting for the trees as Marcus's men stumbled, blinded by the fine powder. "Get them!" Marcus's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and furious. Thomas didn't look back. He pulled Roland with him, running as fast as his legs would carry him, his heart hammering against his ribs. Branches whipped at his arms, the mist curling thicker as they plunged deeper into the forest. Behind them, shouts filled the air, the sound of boots crashing through leaves. Marcus's men were already giving chase, though their steps sounded clumsy at first, slowed by the lingering powder. Thomas's breath came in sharp gasps, his chest burning, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop, not now. Roland stumbled beside him, trying to keep pace, his cloak catching on branches as they tore through the undergrowth. The forest seemed endless, the mist thicker with every step, hiding the path ahead. Thomas glanced back briefly, catching glimpses of lantern light weaving between the trees, closer now than before. Marcus's voice carried through the forest again, calm but edged with anger. "Don't let them reach the town." The words sent a cold shiver down Thomas's spine. Marcus wasn't going to let them go, not alive. Thomas pushed harder, forcing himself to keep moving, every muscle screaming in protest. They had to make it to the outer fields, had to get out of the forest before Marcus's men closed in. But even as they ran, Thomas knew Marcus was still behind them, steady and relentless. And he had the terrifying feeling that Marcus wasn't chasing to catch them. Marcus was hurting them, driving them exactly where he wanted them to go. Thomas pushed forward, the mist closing around him like a living thing, every step feeling heavier as the forest thickened. Roland struggled beside him, his breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps, but he didn't slow. Behind them, the shouts of Marcus's men echoed through the trees, the sound growing closer with every passing second. Lantern light flickered in the distance, bobbing between the trunks like ghostly fireflies, chasing them deeper into the dark. Thomas's mind raced as he ran. Something about Marcus's voice, the way he had shouted his order, gnawed at him. He wasn't simply chasing them. He was steering them. Every path Thomas took felt strangely deliberate, like Marcus had expected him to go this way. The realization twisted his stomach. "Thomas," Roland gasped, stumbling slightly as he ducked under a low branch. "We can't keep this pace for long. If we don't reach the field soon, we'll make it," Thomas said quickly, though his voice was tight, almost desperate. "We just need to stay ahead of them." But even as he said it, he couldn't shake the growing dread that Marcus was already ahead of them. They darted around a cluster of thick oaks, their boots sliding on the damp leaves. The mist seemed to grow thicker, blurring the edges of the path, making it harder to see what lay ahead. Thomas slowed slightly, trying to steady his breathing, when a sound cut through the forest, soft at first, then louder. It wasn't shouting or the pounding of boots. It was something heavier, a low, rhythmic creaking like what's straining under weight. Roland caught Thomas's arm, pulling him to a stop. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. Thomas nodded slowly, straining to listen. The noise grew louder, closer, until the mist ahead seemed to shift unnaturally. Then, as if summoned by the sound, a dark shape loomed ahead on the path. Thomas froze. It wasn't Marcus, and it wasn't his men. It was a wagon. A large, heavy wagon, its wheels sunk slightly into the damp earth. Two lanterns hung from its sides, glowing faintly through the mist. Crates were stacked high in the back, covered with canvas, but Thomas didn't need to see the markings to know what they were. Marcus's supplies. Roland's eyes widened as he stared at the wagon. "He's moving them. He knew you'd come this way. He's making sure no one else finds those crates before morning." Thomas's stomach twisted as the truth settled in. Marcus hadn't just been chasing them. He had herded them straight toward this. Then, before Thomas could speak, a voice cut through the mist. "Smart as ever, apothecary," Marcus said smoothly. Thomas and Roland turned sharply. Marcus stepped into view from the shadows, his figure emerging like a ghost from the fog. He wasn't breathless. He wasn't rushing. He had been waiting. He stood just beyond the wagon, his arms crossed casually, as if this were all a carefully planned meeting. Behind him, two more men appeared, their hands resting on their weapons, their faces hard and silent. "You run well," Marcus continued, stepping closer, his boots silent against the damp ground. "But I told you, this is my forest. I decide where the paths lead." Thomas felt Roland shift beside him, his breathing tight. "You won't get away with this," Roland said firmly, though his voice carried a slight tremor. "I saw what's in those crates. I'll tell the town myself." Marcus smiled slightly, almost amused. "You'll tell them? And what will you say? That the apothecary lured you into the woods in the middle of the night to show you a merchant's wagon? Do you think anyone will believe you over me?" Thomas's hands clenched at his sides, anger pushing through the fear. "It doesn't matter if they believe right away. The truth will spread. It always does." Marcus studied him for a long moment, his smile fading into something colder. "Then I suppose I can't let you return to town at all." One of Marcus's men stepped forward, drawing closer with deliberate slowness. Thomas felt his pulse spike, his mind racing for any possible move. But before Marcus could give the order, something unexpected happened. A rustling came from the trees to their left. Quick, hurried footsteps getting closer fast. Marcus's head snapped toward the sound, his hand moving instinctively toward his blade. "Who's there?" he barked. Thomas turned too, his heart leaping into his throat as a figure burst through the mist. "Elena?" Thomas whispered in shock. She appeared breathless, her cloak torn slightly from running through the woods. Her eyes were wide, darting between Thomas, Roland, and Marcus. She clutched something in her hands, something small but glinting faintly in the lantern light. Marcus's eyes narrowed at her sudden appearance. "Ah," he said slowly, recognition flickering in his gaze. "The girl." His smile returned, sharper now. "I wonder how long before you join this little game." Elena stepped closer, her voice firm despite the fear in her eyes. "I followed you, Marcus. I know what you're doing. Everyone will know if you hurt them." Marcus chuckled, the sound low and humorless. Brave words for someone who just walked into a trap. Thomas's chest tightened. He hadn't wanted Elena here, hadn't wanted her anywhere near Marcus. But now she was standing in the open, and Marcus's men were already moving slightly, circling to cut her off. Elena raised the object in her hands slightly, keeping her grip tight. Thomas squinted through the mist, trying to see what it was. A small flask. Marcus noticed too, his sharp eyes flicking to it briefly. "What's that, girl? One of the apothecary's little tricks? Do you think you can scare me with powders and smoke?" Elena didn't answer. Her jaw tightened, and for a brief second, Thomas saw something flicker in her expression, determination mixed with desperation. Marcus seemed to sense it too, his smile fading. "Don't," he warned, his voice dropping. "You're outnumbered, and you're not fast enough to use it before my men reach you." Elena glanced at Thomas briefly, her eyes locking with his for the briefest heartbeat. Thomas felt his stomach drop. He knew that look. She was about to do something reckless. "Elena," Thomas said sharply, his voice low but urgent. "Don't." But before he could finish, Elena moved. She threw the flask hard to the ground, shattering it against the damp earth. A thick plume of white smoke exploded upward, curling fast and heavy, swallowing the wagon, the trees, and everyone in the clearing. Marcus cursed, stepping back quickly, his men coughing and stumbling in the sudden cloud. "Elena," Thomas called, reaching for her through the growing haze. The smoke thickened instantly, the forest disappearing into a swirling wall of white. Shapes moved within it, Marcus's men shouting, their lanterns swinging wildly. But then, somewhere in the chaos, a sharp voice cut through, closer than Thomas expected. "Don't let them escape," Marcus roared, his voice furious now, no longer calm or controlled. Thomas grabbed Roland's arm, pulling him through the smoke. "We need to move," he said, his voice almost lost in the chaos. But as they stumbled forward, Thomas's heart dropped again. He could no longer see Elena. She had vanished into the smoke. And Marcus's furious shouts grew louder, closer, like he was moving toward them with purpose, as if he already knew exactly where they were headed. The trap wasn't over. The trap was just beginning. Thomas pulled Roland deeper into the smoke, his grip tight as they stumbled blindly through the swirling white haze. The air was thick and bitter, making it hard to breathe, and every direction looked the same, shadows and shifting fog. He could hear Marcus's men shouting, their voices echoing strangely through the mist, but it was impossible to tell how close they were. "Elena," Thomas called, his voice hoarse. He hated the desperation in his own tone, but she didn't answer. The only response was Marcus's voice somewhere behind them, sharper now, angrier. "Find them. Spread out." Marcus barked. "The girl first. She knows too much." Thomas's stomach twisted at the words. He didn't care if Marcus caught him, but if Elena was taken, no, he couldn't think that way. He had to find her. Roland stumbled, coughing into his sleeve. "Thomas, we can't keep running like this. We'll lose each other in the smoke." Thomas stopped briefly, trying to listen. The mist muffled everything, but he strained his ears for any sound of Elena. A faint crunch of leaves came from somewhere to the left, lighter than the heavy boots chasing them. "Elena," Thomas whispered, more to himself than Roland, and then he moved. "This way." They pushed through the low branches, the smoke curling around them like it was alive. Thomas kept his hand on Roland's sleeve, guiding him forward, but his heart pounded faster with every step. The faint sound of movement ahead grew clearer, and then, through a thin break in the mist, he saw her. Elena crouched near the base of a tree, her cloak pulled tight around her, her face streaked with dirt and fear. She looked up sharply as they approached, her relief visible even in the haze. "Thomas," She breathed, standing quickly. He reached her in a few strides, pulling her close. Are you hurt? She shook her head. No, but we don't have much time. Marcus. Before she could finish, a loud crash sounded nearby. A lantern hit the ground, its light spilling across the smoke, revealing the dark shapes of Marcus's men closing in fast. Thomas's mind raced. Running straight would only lead them back into the trap Marcus had set. But if they stayed still, they'd be found. Roland glanced behind them, his expression grim. We need to move now. Thomas scanned the trees through the haze. The wagon wasn't far. He could barely make out its shadow. And then an idea sparked, dangerous and desperate. Elena, he said quickly, keeping his voice low, do you still have any of your powders left? She nodded, pulling a small pouch from under her cloak. Just one. But it's strong. It's meant for clearing out infected rats, not people. Thomas gave a sharp nod. Good. That's what we need. Roland looked at him sharply. What are you planning? Thomas didn't answer, already moving toward the wagon. He crouched low, keeping his steps quiet. The smoke still hung thick, giving them a chance to move unseen, at least for now. Elena followed him closely, Roland reluctantly bringing up the rear. The wagon loomed larger as they approached, its crates stacked high, the markings barely visible in the dim light. Thomas stopped beside one of the lower crates, running his hands quickly along its surface until he found what he was looking for, a small latch, slightly loose. He pried it open with his knife, revealing several sealed jars of powdered herbs inside. Marcus's poisons. Thomas's plan solidified instantly. Elena, he whispered, mix your powder with this. We'll use the smoke against them. Her eyes widened slightly. Thomas, these are dangerous. If we use too much, we don't need much, he said quickly. Just enough to drive them back. If Marcus thinks the wagon's been compromised, he'll have to pull back. Roland frowned, glancing over his shoulder at the approaching shouts. And if it doesn't work? Thomas's jaw tightened. Then we run for the fields and hope we're faster. Elena didn't argue. She opened her pouch, sprinkling the fine powder into one of the open jars. Thomas stirred it quickly, his hands moving with practiced precision. The sharp, bitter scent filled the air immediately, strong enough to sting his eyes. He placed the jar back into the crate, carefully leaving the lid loose. When they get close, we'll tip it, he said, his voice low. But before they could move into position, Marcus's voice cut through the smoke again, closer this time. You can't hide forever, Thomas. His tone was different now. Not just angry, but curious, almost amused, like he was enjoying the hunt. Thomas felt the hair on the back of his neck rise. Marcus was close, too close. A lantern's glow broke through the mist ahead, swinging closer. The crunch of boots grew louder. Thomas glanced at Elena. Now, he whispered. She nodded, and together they tipped the crate sharply, spilling the mixed powder into the damp ground. The bitter scent thickened instantly as the smoke caught the rising haze, swirling heavier and sharper. The effect was immediate. The men closest to them began coughing violently, stumbling back, their lanterns swinging wildly as they tried to escape the sudden burning in their throats and eyes. One of them dropped his weapon, shouting hoarsely for the others to fall back. Through the chaos, Marcus's sharp voice rang out. Don't breathe in. Get clear. Thomas didn't wait for Marcus to adjust. Run, he hissed, grabbing Elena's hand and pulling her into the thickest part of the smoke. Roland followed, though his coughs grew louder with every step. They moved fast, weaving through the trees, the shouting behind them growing more frantic as Marcus tried to regain control. But Thomas didn't slow, guiding them through the forest by memory. The mist began to thin slightly as they pushed forward, the trees giving way to a wider path. The cool air tasted cleaner, fresher, and Thomas felt a flicker of hope. They were close to the fields. But just as the trees began to open, a figure stepped out from behind a trunk ahead of them. Marcus. He stood alone this time, his cloak dark against the pale mist, his expression sharp but calm despite the chaos behind him. He had anticipated this too. Thomas stopped abruptly, nearly pulling Elena off her feet. Roland skidded to a halt behind them, his breathing heavy. Marcus tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing as he studied them. "Clever trick," he said softly, his voice almost approving. "But you really don't understand, do you? You can't win this. You can't stop me." Thomas's chest tightened, but he held Marcus's gaze, refusing to look away. Marcus stepped closer, slow and deliberate, his voice dropping to a cold whisper. "This ends now. No more running." Behind Marcus, faint shapes moved in the mist again. His men were catching up, slowly, circling around. Thomas felt his heart hammering in his chest. There was no smoke left to hide them, no powders to buy time. This was it. And Marcus, with that same cold smile, took one more step forward. Thomas stood frozen, his breath shallow, every nerve on edge as Marcus stepped closer, closing the distance with deliberate slowness. The mist had thinned now, curling low to the ground, exposing the three of them fully. Roland shifted behind Thomas, tense, his hands clenching at his sides. Elena stood rigid, her eyes darting between Marcus and the faint shadows of his men moving through the trees. "Do you feel it now?" Marcus said quietly, his tone almost conversational. "That pressure in your chest, that panic clawing at you? That's what happens when you stand in the way of something too big to stop." Thomas didn't move. His heart pounded against his ribs, but his jaw tightened as he held Marcus's gaze. "You're not too big to stop. You're just a man hiding behind poison and lies." For a brief second, Marcus's expression flickered, annoyance breaking through his calm mask. But then he smiled again, slow and controlled. "Still so bold," he said, almost amused. "But boldness doesn't keep you alive." He glanced briefly toward the trees. The shadows shifted closer, his men tightening the circle around them. Lantern light glimmered faintly through the mist as they crept in, silent now, waiting for Marcus's command. Thomas's pulse raced. They had seconds at most before Marcus made his move. He scanned the ground quickly, his eyes darting to the wagon trail behind Marcus, to the scattered leaves and roots underfoot. Nothing useful. No more powders, no tricks left. Elena shifted slightly closer to Thomas, her voice barely a whisper. "What do we do?" Thomas didn't answer immediately, his mind racing. They couldn't run, not with Marcus's men blocking the path. Fighting Marcus head-on would be suicide. But maybe they didn't need to win, just distract him long enough to slip through the tightening circle. Marcus took another step forward, his boots silent on the damp ground. "Last chance, Thomas. Walk away now. Leave this forest and forget what you saw. Or," his smile sharpened, "or you stay here, and this ends badly for all of you." Thomas glanced briefly at Roland, whose face was pale but determined. The priest gave the slightest nod, as if silently telling him not to give in. Thomas straightened slightly, forcing calm into his voice. "I can't walk away, Marcus." Marcus sighed, almost as if disappointed, and gave a small flick of his hand. The shadows around them moved instantly. Marcus's men stepped closer, their weapons ready, their lanterns casting long, wavering beams of light through the mist. Thomas's heart pounded. They had to act now. "Elena," Thomas whispered sharply, keeping his eyes on Marcus, "be ready to run when I move." Marcus's sharp eyes caught the whisper, and his smile returned. "Oh no," he said softly. "You won't get that chance." Then, in a single motion, Marcus lunged. Thomas reacted on instinct, sidestepping quickly and grabbing Roland's arm, pulling him backward. Marcus's men surged forward at the same time, the clearing erupting into chaos. Thomas ducked low as one of the men swung at him, narrowly avoiding the strike. He shoved Roland toward a narrow gap between two trees, shouting, "Go!" Roland stumbled forward, Elena right behind him, but Marcus's voice cut through the shouts like a blade. "Don't let them through." Two of Marcus's men moved to block the gap, their weapons raised. Thomas's stomach tightened. There was no clear escape. He grabbed a fallen branch from the ground, swinging it hard at the closest man. The blow wasn't strong enough to do serious damage, but it startled him, knocking the lantern from his hand. The lantern hit the ground, spilling burning oil across the damp leaves. The flames caught slowly, licking at the wet ground, but the sudden light and smoke created a moment of confusion. "Elena now!" Thomas shouted. Elena darted forward, slipping past one of the distracted men. Roland followed, ducking low to avoid another swing. Marcus cursed sharply, his calm finally cracking. "Stop them!" Thomas turned to follow, but Marcus was already there, blocking his path. The firelight flickered against Marcus's face, highlighting the sharp focus in his eyes. "You're not leaving, Thomas," Marcus said, his voice low and steady despite the chaos. Thomas tightened his grip on the branch, his heart hammering. "I'm not staying either." Marcus lunged again, faster than Thomas expected. Thomas swung the branch hard, aiming for Marcus's side, but Marcus caught it with one hand, twisting it out of his grip effortlessly. Thomas stumbled back, trying to stay out of reach, but Marcus moved in quickly, his hand grabbing Thomas by the collar, yanking him forward. "You should have stayed quiet," Marcus hissed. Thomas struggled, pushing against Marcus's grip, but Marcus was stronger, his hold like iron. "Thomas!" Elena's voice rang out sharply. Marcus turned his head slightly at the sound, just for a second, but it was enough. Thomas twisted hard, slipping free from Marcus's grasp, and shoved him backward with all his strength. Marcus staggered a step, his boots sliding on the damp leaves. "Run!" Thomas shouted again, his voice desperate. Elena and Roland had already pushed farther down the narrow path, glancing back only briefly before disappearing into the mist. Thomas darted after them, but Marcus recovered quickly, his voice roaring through the chaos. "After them! Don't let them reach the fields." The chase began again, but now it was fiercer, more desperate. Marcus's men crashed through the undergrowth, their shouts echoing through the thinning mist. Lanterns bobbed wildly behind Thomas as he sprinted, every muscle screaming in protest. The mist was breaking apart now, the air growing clearer as the trees began to thin. Thomas pushed harder, the hope of open fields spurring him forward. But Marcus's voice stayed close, closer than it should have been. "You can't outrun me, Thomas." Thomas didn't look back, his focus locked on the faint outline of the tree line ahead. They were almost there, just a little farther. Then Marcus's voice came again, lower this time, almost calm despite the chase. "Do you really think you're the only one with secrets, Thomas?" The words made Thomas's chest tighten, but he didn't slow. "You think you're better than me," Marcus continued, his voice carrying strangely clear through the night. "But I know what you've been hiding in your shop. I know who you've treated without reporting it. Do you think the town will still trust you when they learn?" Thomas's steps faltered for just a second, his heart sinking. Marcus knew. Marcus's laugh followed, sharp and mocking. "Ah, so you understand. When I catch you, and I will, maybe I won't even need to kill you. Maybe I'll just let the town destroy you for me." Thomas clenched his teeth, forcing himself to keep moving despite the knot forming in his chest. Whatever Marcus thought he knew didn't matter now. Survival mattered. Exposing Marcus mattered. The trees ahead began to part, and Thomas caught sight of the faint glow of moonlight on open ground. "The fields." "Elena," he called, his voice raw. "I see it," she shouted back just ahead of him. Roland was close to her, though he looked ready to collapse. Thomas pushed harder, his legs burning, but behind him, Marcus's footsteps were steady, relentless. The edge of the forest loomed closer. They were almost free, and then, just as they reached the last line of trees, Marcus's voice rose again, cold and certain. "You think this is the end, Thomas?" "No, this is where it truly begins." Something in his tone made Thomas glance back despite himself. Marcus wasn't running anymore. He was standing still, his hand raised slightly, giving a signal. And from the tree line ahead, before Thomas could react, two more figures stepped out of the shadows, blocking the way to the open fields. Marcus had planned for this too. Thomas skidded to a halt, his chest heaving, as the two figures moved closer, their faces hidden by hoods. One of them carried a crossbow, already raised, the bolt glinting faintly in the moonlight. Elena froze, her eyes widening. Roland stumbled to a stop behind her, his expression pale. Marcus's voice carried easily through the trees, calm once more. There's nowhere left to run. Thomas's heart pounded as he realized the truth. Marcus hadn't been chasing them to tire them out. He had been driving them straight into another trap. And now, cornered between Marcus's men behind them and the armed figures ahead, Thomas understood that the real danger was only just beginning. Thomas's chest rose and fell rapidly as he stood frozen between the two dangers. The forest behind him was alive with the crashing sounds of Marcus's men drawing closer, and the clearing ahead was blocked by those two hooded figures, their faces hidden in shadow. The crossbow pointed directly at him didn't waver, and the other figure, taller, broader, held a short blade, its edge catching the faint moonlight. Elena's hand tightened on Thomas's sleeve, her breath quick and uneven. Roland stood rigid, his face pale, his hand instinctively clutching the wooden cross that hung from his neck. The silence that hung in the air now felt heavier than any shouting or running. Marcus stepped slowly into view from the mist behind them, his boots quiet against the damp ground. His calm voice carried clearly through the night. "I told you, Thomas. You don't win against me. I know every path, every turn, every escape you think you have. You've been walking exactly where I wanted you." Thomas didn't answer, his eyes darting between the crossbow and Marcus. The man with the weapon ahead stood unervingly still, his aim steady despite the faint tremor of leaves around him. Marcus stopped a few paces away, folding his hands casually behind his back, as if this were nothing more than a discussion between acquaintances. "I'll admit," Marcus said, his tone almost conversational, "you lasted longer than I expected. You're clever, determined. But clever men die just as easily as fools when they don't know when to stop." Elena's voice, sharp and defiant despite her fear, cut through the quiet. "You won't get away with this. People will find out what you've done." Marcus tilted his head slightly toward her, his smile returning, cold and calculating. "Will they? A runaway girl, a priest who followed the wrong man into the woods, and an apothecary with too many secrets of his own. Tell me, which of you will they believe?" Thomas felt his jaw tighten. Marcus's words weren't just a threat. They were calculated to dig under his skin. And worse, Marcus was right about one thing. His own past dealings, the times he had treated people quietly without reporting it to the authorities, could be twisted against him if Marcus ever spoke of it publicly. But Thomas pushed the thought aside. Right now, none of that mattered. What mattered was finding a way out. The man with the crossbow shifted slightly, his grip steady, his hood shadowing most of his face. Thomas studied him carefully, his mind racing. The man wasn't aiming to scare them. His stance was trained, prepared. If he fired, it would be clean and quick. Marcus took another slow step forward, his voice softening almost mockingly. "I'll make this simple. You come with me quietly, and maybe I won't let them shoot. Maybe I'll even let the girl live. She doesn't have to pay for your mistakes, Thomas." Thomas's stomach tightened, but Elena straightened, her voice steady despite the danger. "I'm not leaving him." Marcus's gaze flicked toward her, almost amused. "Brave, but foolish. Loyalty like that gets you killed." The tension hung like a drawn bowstring. The hooded man's crossbow didn't waver, and Marcus's men behind them were only seconds away from closing the circle completely. Thomas's mind raced, searching desperately for an opening. He had no powders left, no clever tricks. But he did have one thing Marcus hadn't planned for. Marcus thought he would give up. He was counting on it. Thomas took a slow breath, forcing his hands to stay loose at his sides. "You're right about one thing, Marcus," he said finally, his voice calm but firm. "I can't stop you by fighting you here. But you're wrong if you think I came into these woods without leaving any proof behind." Marcus's expression didn't change, but Thomas saw the faintest flicker of curiosity in his eyes. Thomas pressed on, his tone steady, almost casual. "The priest isn't the only one who knows what you've been doing. There are people in town who already have the names, the records, the crates markings. If we don't return, they'll talk." It was a lie, at least partly. Thomas had shared some of his suspicions with a few trusted villagers, but nothing as complete as Marcus would believe. Still, Marcus didn't know that, and Thomas had to make him hesitate. Marcus's smile faded slightly, his eyes narrowing as he studied Thomas. "You expect me to believe that?" Thomas met his gaze firmly. "You can kill us, but it won't change anything. By tomorrow, everyone will know." Marcus stayed silent for a long moment, the only sound the faint rustling of leaves in the cold night breeze. Behind Thomas, the shouts of Marcus's men were growing closer, but they hadn't yet burst fully into the clearing. Finally, Marcus spoke, his tone colder now. "You're lying?" Thomas didn't blink. "Then take the risk." The moment stretched, tense and silent. Thomas felt his heartbeat in his throat, waiting for Marcus's decision. Marcus's gaze flicked briefly toward the hooded man with the crossbow, as if weighing his options. The man shifted slightly, his aim still locked on Thomas, but he didn't fire. Elena whispered quickly, just loud enough for Thomas to hear, "If he hesitates, we run." Marcus's attention snapped back to Thomas, his smile returning slowly, though it no longer reached his eyes. "You're clever," he said softly. "Too clever for your own good." Then, in a sudden motion, Marcus raised his hand. The crossbow fired. The bolt flew past Thomas's arm, missing by inches and thudding into a tree trunk behind him. Elena gasped, stepping back, but Thomas didn't move. He couldn't, not with Marcus's men only a breath away. Marcus's smile widened slightly, as if amused by Thomas's restraint. "A warning," Marcus said calmly. "The next one won't miss. You have one more chance to come quietly." Thomas forced himself to meet Marcus's gaze. His mind was racing again, but this time not with fear, with realization. Marcus hadn't ordered a kill shot. Not yet. For all his confidence, Marcus still wasn't certain about Thomas's claim. He was trying to scare him into surrendering before taking the risk of exposing himself fully, which meant Thomas still had a chance. "Elena," Thomas said quietly, his voice barely more than a breath. "When I move, run left. Head for the fields. Don't stop." She looked at him sharply, but he didn't give her time to argue. Marcus's men were seconds away now, their footsteps growing louder behind them. The trap was closing. Thomas glanced once at Roland, who gave a tight nod, understanding instantly. Marcus tilted his head slightly, raising his hand again. "Time's up, Thomas." Thomas didn't wait for him to lower it. In one swift motion, Thomas grabbed the branch he had dropped earlier, swinging it sharply at the lantern lying on the ground nearby. The lantern shattered, flames flaring suddenly as oil spilled across the leaves. The fire leapt fast, licking upward, sending a wave of heat and smoke into the air. The hooded man with the crossbow stepped back instinctively, his aim faltering for a split second. "Now!" Thomas shouted. Elena bolted left, sprinting toward the thinning trees. Roland followed, ducking low as Marcus's men burst into the clearing from behind. Marcus's voice roared over the chaos. "Don't let them through." But Thomas didn't follow immediately. He swung the burning lantern base toward the ground again, sending another burst of flames upward. Smoke rolled across the clearing, thickening quickly as the dry underbrush caught. Marcus stepped back sharply, his calm finally cracking. "Stop him!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the confusion. Thomas darted toward the trees, weaving through the rising smoke, but Marcus was already moving after him, faster than Thomas expected. The chase began again, but this time the stakes were higher than ever. The forest was catching fire, Marcus was only a few steps behind, and Elena and Roland were running blindly into open ground. And for the first time, Thomas realized Marcus wasn't trying to corner them anymore. He was hunting them. The forest glowed with an eerie orange as the fire spread, licking up tree trunks and curling smoke into the night sky. The crackling of burning wood mixed with shouts and frantic movement as Marcus's men scrambled to regain control. Thomas ran hard, his lungs burning as much from the smoke as from exhaustion, his eyes darting through the haze for any sign of Elena and Roland. The air was thick, suffocating, but the open fields had to be close now. He could almost taste the fresh wind that lay beyond the trees. Yet Marcus's presence pressed close behind him, steady and relentless. Thomas didn't need to look back to know Marcus was there. He could feel him, his footsteps matching Thomas's rhythm, his voice cutting through the roar of the flames. "You won't escape this time, Thomas," Marcus shouted, his voice deeper now, carrying that cold certainty Thomas had learned to hate. Thomas pushed forward, darting between two burning branches that fell dangerously close, sparks scattering around him. He caught sight of movement ahead, Elena's cloak disappearing through the thinning trees. Relief surged through him. She was almost out. "Elena," he called hoarsely. She glanced back, her face streaked with soot, her eyes wide with determination. Roland was beside her, slower but still moving, though every step looked like it cost him everything. But Marcus was closing in fast. Thomas made a split-second decision. He slowed just enough to grab a half-burnt branch from the ground, its end glowing faintly with embers. He turned sharply, swinging it behind him as Marcus lunged closer. Marcus dodged easily, his movements sharp and controlled, but the delay bought Thomas a few more seconds to reach the others. As Thomas broke through the last of the trees, the open field finally stretched before him, bathed in silver moonlight. The air was clearer here, cool against his smoke-stung skin. Elena and Roland stumbled into the open, coughing hard, but they didn't stop moving. For one breathless moment, Thomas thought they had made it. But Marcus stepped out of the smoke a second later, calm despite the chaos, his boots crunching on the grass. His cloak was streaked with ash, his hair damp with sweat, but his eyes burned with that same cold focus. "You can run into the fields," Marcus said, his voice steady even as the fire raged behind him, "but you can't outrun me. Not tonight." Thomas turned to face him, breathing hard. He could feel Elena just behind him, could hear Roland's shaky breaths, but he didn't step back. He had run enough. Marcus took a slow step forward, his hand resting near the dagger at his belt. "This ends now." Thomas tightened his grip on the burning branch, holding it like a makeshift weapon. "You're right," he said, his voice low but firm. "It does." Marcus smiled faintly, almost amused by Thomas's defiance, and then he lunged. The two men collided hard, the impact driving Thomas slightly backward. Marcus swung the dagger in a sharp arc, but Thomas twisted, the blade grazing his sleeve instead of cutting into his arm. He shoved the burning branch between them, forcing Marcus to step back as the embers flared dangerously close to his face. Marcus swiped the branch aside with his free hand, knocking it away, and drove forward again, his dagger flashing in the moonlight. Thomas grabbed Marcus's wrist, struggling to keep the blade away from his chest. The two of them locked in a tense grapple. For a moment, it was all instinct, the push and pull of bodies, the scrape of boots on grass, the heat of Marcus's breath close to his face. "You can't win," Marcus hissed. Thomas's grip tightened, his muscles screaming with effort. "I don't have to win," he said through clenched teeth. "I just have to make sure everyone sees you for what you are." Marcus's eyes narrowed, his strength surging as he tried to force the blade closer to Thomas's chest. But Thomas twisted suddenly, using Marcus's own weight against him, and shoved hard. Marcus stumbled backward, his boot catching on the uneven ground. For the first time, his composure slipped as he fell hard onto the grass, his dagger landing a few feet away. Thomas didn't hesitate. He darted forward, kicking the blade farther out of Marcus's reach. Elena rushed to Thomas's side, her eyes darting between them. "Thomas, we have to go." "The fire." Before she could finish, Marcus rolled onto his side, his hand reaching into his cloak. His eyes burned with fury now, his calm shattered. "You think it's over?" he spat, pulling something small and metallic from his pocket. Thomas's stomach dropped when he saw it. A small vial, its liquid shimmering faintly in the moonlight. One of his own apothecary concoctions, stolen from the crates. "Marcus, don't," Thomas began, stepping forward. Marcus's smile returned, twisted now, desperate. "If I can't control this town, no one will." He raised the vial high, ready to throw it to the ground. Thomas didn't think. He lunged, slamming into Marcus just as the vial slipped from his fingers. The glass shattered against the grass, releasing a sharp, acrid scent that filled the air instantly. Marcus and Thomas both rolled to the side, coughing as the chemical fumes rose around them. "Elena, get back," Thomas shouted, his voice muffled by the smoke. Marcus struggled to rise, his movements sluggish as the fumes burned his eyes and throat. Thomas forced himself up despite the stinging in his own lungs, pushing Marcus back down with a firm shove. Marcus coughed hard, his eyes watering as he glared up at Thomas. "You ruined everything." Thomas stared down at him, his chest heaving, his own eyes stinging. "No, Marcus," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "You ruined yourself." For a long second, Marcus lay still, coughing and gasping for breath. The fight drained from him, his strength fading as the fumes overwhelmed him. His men's shouts echoed faintly in the distance, but none of them were close enough to help. Thomas stepped back, grabbing Elena's hand. "We need to move now." Elena nodded quickly, helping Roland to his feet. The three of them turned toward the open fields, running as fast as their tired bodies would allow. The fire in the forest crackled louder behind them, its glow growing brighter against the night sky. As they reached the edge of the field, Thomas slowed, glancing back one last time. Marcus was still on the ground, his figure barely visible through the rising smoke. For a brief moment, Thomas felt something unexpected, not victory, but an odd heaviness in his chest. Marcus had been dangerous, cruel, but also clever enough to almost win. And Thomas knew this wasn't just about one man's greed. There were others like Marcus, waiting to fill the same shadowed roles. But at least tonight, one of them had been stopped. Elena touched his arm gently. "Thomas," she said softly, "it's over. We have to go." Thomas gave a small nod, turning back toward the fields. Together, the three of them walked into the cool night air, leaving the burning forest behind. But as the smoke curled higher into the sky, a sharp crack echoed faintly behind them. Thomas turned his head slightly, his brows furrowing. Through the haze, Marcus was no longer lying on the ground. His figure had disappeared. Thomas's chest tightened. He stared at the smoke-filled forest for a long moment, his mind racing. Marcus wasn't dead, and if he was still alive, then tonight might not have been the end after all. The quiet of the fields felt almost deceptive now, like the calm before another storm. Because Marcus would come back. And next time, Thomas knew, Marcus wouldn't make the same mistakes. The night air felt almost too quiet after the chaos of the burning forest. The crackling of flames grew softer as Thomas, Elena, and Roland crossed deeper into the open fields, their footsteps slow now, no longer driven by the frantic rush to survive. The stars stretched endlessly above them, the moon casting silver light across the grass, and for the first time in hours, Thomas felt the weight of exhaustion settle fully into his body. Every muscle ached, his lungs still burned from the smoke, but at least they were alive. Elena slowed beside him, glancing back once toward the distant glow of fire against the trees. Her face was streaked with soot, her hair tangled, but there was a steadiness in her gaze now, as if the worst of her fear had finally eased. Roland stumbled slightly, leaning on her for support, his face pale, but determined to keep moving. "Are you both all right?" Thomas asked, his voice hoarse. Elena nodded, though her breathing was still heavy. "Just tired," she said, "and worried about what comes next." Roland gave a faint smile, his voice low. "I think we're allowed to rest for a moment before we worry about that." Thomas wanted to agree, but his thoughts were already circling back to Marcus. He hadn't seen Marcus when they left the forest. He hadn't seen him lying still, hadn't seen him fall, and that absence felt heavier than any victory. Marcus wasn't the kind of man who disappeared quietly. They stopped near a small rise in the field, the grass bending gently in the cool wind. Thomas helped Roland sit against a low mound, while Elena knelt beside him, checking the scratches on his arms. Thomas crouched a few steps away, running a hand through the grass as he stared back toward the forest. The firelight flickered faintly in the distance, painting the horizon orange and black. "Do you think he's still alive?" Elena asked softly, as if reading Thomas's thoughts. Thomas hesitated, his eyes fixed on the burning trees. "Yes," he said finally, his voice quiet but certain. Marcus doesn't give up that easily. Elena frowned slightly, worry flickering across her face. Then he'll come after us again? Maybe, Thomas admitted. But he's wounded now, not just in body but in reputation. The fire, the men who saw what happened tonight, they'll talk. It won't be as easy for him to hide anymore. Roland shifted slightly, his voice weak but steady. And you have proof now, Thomas. Those crates, the markings, the vials he used, all of that can be shown to the right people. He can't silence everyone. Thomas nodded slowly. That was true, but Marcus was clever. He would twist the truth, as he always did, turn accusations into doubts, make Thomas look like the villain instead. The thought made his chest tighten. Elena seemed to sense his hesitation. She looked at him firmly, her voice soft but certain. We can still tell the truth, Thomas. And we're not alone this time. People trust you. If we stand together, they'll listen. Thomas glanced at her, and for a moment, he allowed himself to believe it. She was right. For all of Marcus's power, he thrived in shadows. Bringing everything into the open was the best way to fight him. They sat in silence for a while, the cool wind brushing against their faces, the distant fire slowly dimming as the forest burned itself out. Thomas's breathing steadied, his thoughts settling. The night felt fragile but peaceful, as if the land itself was trying to heal from what had just happened. When Roland finally dozed off against the grass, Elena leaned closer to Thomas, her voice quiet. Do you regret it? Not turning back earlier, not walking away when you had the chance. Thomas shook his head. No, he said simply. If I had walked away, Marcus would have kept poisoning people, kept hurting anyone who got his way. Someone had to stand against him. Elena looked at him for a long moment before nodding. You did the right thing, she said softly. Thomas wanted to believe that, though part of him still carried the weight of what had happened. The chase, the fire, the people Marcus had manipulated for so long. But as he looked at Elena and Roland, alive and safe beside him, he felt something close to relief. Eventually, they began walking again, moving slowly across the fields toward the distant outline of the town. Dawn was beginning to lighten the horizon, painting the sky pale blue and soft gold. The first birds stirred in the grass, their quiet songs breaking the heavy silence of the night. By the time they reached the outer edge of the town, the sun was rising, casting long shadows across the empty streets. The air smelled of dew and smoke, faint but lingering. A few villagers were already awake, staring toward the distant glow of the burned forest. Thomas felt their eyes turn toward him as he passed, curiosity and suspicion mixing in their expressions. Elena walked beside him, her chin raised, her steps steady despite her exhaustion. Roland leaned on Thomas for support, but there was a quiet strength in his posture too. When they reached Thomas's apothecary, he paused at the doorway, his hand resting on the wooden frame. The shop looked the same as it always had, quiet and unassuming, but Thomas knew things would never truly be the same again. Elena looked at him, her voice soft. What will you do now? Thomas glanced at the shelves inside, filled with jars and herbs, the tools of his trade. The same thing I've always done, he said after a moment. Help people, tell the truth. But now, I'll have to be louder about it. No more working in the shadows. Elena smiled faintly, a tired but genuine smile. Then you won't be alone in that. Thomas looked at her, and for the first time in what felt like days, a small, true smile touched his face. I know. Roland stirred slightly, his voice quiet but firm despite his fatigue. We'll make sure Marcus doesn't get another chance to do this again. Thomas nodded, though deep down he knew Marcus wasn't finished. The man was too clever, too determined to disappear completely. But now, Marcus had been forced into the light, and Thomas wasn't the only one who would be watching him. As the sun rose higher, casting warm light across the town, Thomas stepped inside his shop, Elena and Roland following close behind. The world outside still carried its dangers, its shadows, but for now, there was a moment of calm, a fragile but real peace after the long, harrowing night. And though Thomas knew Marcus might return someday, he also knew something had changed forever. This time, Marcus wouldn't be hunting a single apothecary in secret. He would be facing a town that finally knew the truth. For now, that was enough. And as Thomas placed his tools back onto the work table, the familiar scent of herbs filling the air, he allowed himself to breathe deeply for the first time in days. The fight wasn't over, but this chapter was. The morning light spilled across the jars and dried leaves, touching everything with soft gold. And for the first time in a long while, Thomas felt a quiet certainty settle over him. No matter how many shadows Marcus tried to hide in, light had a way of finding them. And when it did, Thomas would be ready.